G'day, mate, 40 here, and I need you to know that I get it. Like, I remember those glorious days when I would always begin this show by 8 a.m. on the West Coast. So you're wondering, 40, you're just getting later and later. It's inconvenient, it's annoying. Like, why can't you stick to a schedule? And I need to ask you, do you know what love is? Do you want to go where love is? Right? Because when you've had that experience of true love, right, it just shakes you to your core. And I've experienced that. And you think, 40, this is just another infatuation. This is just another symptom of your love addiction. 40, we just want to get right into decoding the Trump doctrine. Like, stop talking to us about love. But when you've experienced true love, right, you wake up in the middle of the night and you want to start cleaning, and you're thinking, 40, you're right, you're all about scrubbing your toilet now. Is that why you're late? And see, you live in a material world, but I'm a very spiritual person. I'm not just talking about physical cleaning. I'm talking about a deep cleaning of the soul, because when you've experienced something luminous and transcendent and inspiring and vibrant, when you have experienced true love, right, it just creates a rearrangement of the soul. And so that delayed me. Then whenever I go grocery shopping, right, I always order too much for my fridge. And so I have to jam stuff in that doesn't belong. And then I break the wrapper on my frozen yogurt bars. And of course I have to eat them then, because I can't let them go to waste. And I have to eat and drink too much stuff, so I don't let anything go to waste. And that's inconvenient. But also, I need to become clear about who I am, where I'm coming from. I do this wheel of awareness meditation exercise now before my show. So if the show has to be delayed so I can do my wheel of awareness meditation exercise, then the show will be delayed, because getting in touch with what's going on inside of you, with your body, with your emotions, with your mind, with your social outlook, right? That's important. That the position of the observer is an integral part of the data, right? Einstein taught us that. And then I do my most productive blogging on Sunday morning. I get so excited about the show. And yeah, the show's delayed 2 hours, but think about the clarity and the specificity and the profundity and the depth that I have developed in my blog post this morning prior to launching this show. So I could just start on time, right, and just start blathering away. I could be completely indifferent to what's going on inside of me. I could just forget about what's driving me. I could ignore my social incentives. But what's going on with me is going to profoundly shape everything I say. And so I'm here for you. Well, am I really? But anyway, let's find out from Fox News what's going on.
The FBI and the CIA have been tracking his drug trafficking, his crimes against humanity right here in the United States. And to see him brought to justice is incredibly satisfying for those families that have to live without their loved ones today because of the crimes that he's committed for decades.
Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem revealing Nicolás Maduro's capture by U.S. forces was years in the making. Welcome to a second hour of Fox News Live. I'm Mike Emanuel in Washington. Thank you for joining us. Video obtained by Fox News shows DEA agents escorting Maduro in handcuffs during his perp walk yesterday. He now sits in a detention center in Brooklyn, New York, awaiting his first court appearance tomorrow at noon. We have Fox News team coverage, CB Cotton live outside the Brooklyn Detention Center. But we begin with Lucas Tomlinson live in West Palm Beach, Florida. He has new details on how the Trump administration worked to capture Maduro. Lucas?
Good afternoon, Mike. It's being called by some as the greatest special operations mission in history. Nicolás Maduro and his wife snatched in the middle of the night by U.S. Special Operations forces. Now he's been returned to New York to face charges, and President Trump says he will be picking a new leader for Venezuela and is not ruling out sending U.S. forces back to the country to help secure it.
We're going to run the country until such time as we can do a safe, proper, and judicious transition. So we don't want to be involved with having somebody else get in, and we have the same situation that we had for the last long period of years.
President Trump gave the order to launch the mission to snatch Maduro and his wife late Friday night. Before sundown yesterday, both were in New York awaiting charges. Trump's ambassador to the United Nations says for years it was China exploiting the country.
Taking things like ports and rail and food supplies right in our Western Hemisphere, right in Central South America. And this is why, amongst many reasons, this is such a critical national security issue.
At a press conference in Mar-a-Lago after the mission, I asked President Trump how he would deal with Maduro's previous allies.
So, yeah, it's important to know, like, why do I do this? And I do this because I have a delusion. I have a tendency to think I'm the smartest person in the room, and this is almost always a delusion. Like, I think I've got something important and valuable to say, but reality compels me to admit that this is probably a delusion. But the good news is I consulted with Gemini, and it gave me ways that I can channel this delusion to pro-social lens. So some people react to like early childhood trauma by making themselves smaller and more inoffensive. Then other people, like my father and like me, we reacted to our childhood trauma by making ourselves like larger and more offensive. I'm kind of amazed. I've been talking to my friends, and they all learn very early on to give teachers what they want, to give authority what it wants, and to give employers what they want. And I didn't internalize that, certainly not as early as they did. So many of my teachers said I was the most challenging student they ever had. And I still, at times, it's so embarrassing how often I think that I'm the smartest person in the room and just absolutely no evidence for that. Whew. So the reason, I think probably the number one reason that I blog so much and vlog so much and share so many opinions on such a wide part of life is that I have this delusion still operating, and you'd have to look at my life objectively and go, maladaptive delusion 40, right? That I'm the smartest person in the room, right? What the hell can I say about the Trump doctrine that smarter, more accomplished people haven't said?
And his wife were stats in the night, Mike.
We will follow it every step of the way. Lucas Tomlinson reporting live from West Palm. Lucas, many thanks. Here's the video of Maduro's perp walk obtained by Fox News as the Trump administration facing some pushback from New York Democrats, like the city's new socialist mayor Zoran Mamdani. CB Cotton is outside the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn with more on that and the latest ahead of Maduro's arraignment. Hi, CB.
Hey, Michael. Nicolás Maduro is here behind me, behind bars. He'll be arraigned tomorrow at noon Eastern. And as you mentioned, newly minted New York City Mayor and Democratic Socialist Zoran Mamdani says he called President Trump directly to express his opposition to the military action that got us to this point. And, you know, he's not the only New York leader who.
So Trump says so many outrageous things, but I think the most outrageous thing that he said with regard to this Venezuela operation is that the United States will run Venezuela. And then the only thing that's more outrageous than that is that the mainstream media takes him literally and seriously, right? Didn't Trump say in February that the United States is going to run the Gaza Strip? Just because Donald Trump says that America is going to run Venezuela doesn't mean that he is intent on having the United States run Venezuela. What explains the very literal-minded U.S. coverage? Let's have a look at the chat, right? Luke is losing his fastball. I prefer Noam Chomsky. Wow, YouTube now holds creators accountable for off-platform activity, 2026 new rules. That's interesting, but it kind of makes sense that everything we do affects other people. And so I try to shape what I say on here in a way that is neutral or pro-social. So I don't operate under the delusion that this is just transforming lives for the good en masse. But if it does have an effect, I would prefer that it have a pro-social effect. So everything leaks out, right? Everything we do affects other people, even the most private things, right? It's still going to leak out, still going to affect other people. So why is the mainstream media just so literal, right? We are under no obligation to take people at their word. We're under no obligation to take Donald Trump at his word, to take me at my word, take you at your word, right? In February, Donald Trump said the U.S. would take over and own the Gaza Strip. He called it oceanfront property. He called it incredible real estate. He said the U.S. would level it, remove the debris, and rebuild it as a Riviera of the Middle East. And the media took that as a literal annexation plan, right? But very quickly, in reality, this Trump plan to run the Gaza Strip shifted into some kind of vague proposal for international development zones and safe communities, and the whole idea that the U.S. would run it just evaporated as soon as reality set in. Now we're seeing the same replay, right? Trump saying the U.S. will run Venezuela, and it will stay until such a time as a proper transition can take place. All right, I don't believe that. Right? It's just business developer language. Everyone in real estate development is a liar, right? It's just, it seems that there are certain sectors of life where you just have to tell lies to make a go of it. Like if all your competitors are lying and you're telling the truth, may not be the best business strategy.
They're going to say that it is unjustified, it's provoked, that it sets a dangerous precedent, all very predictable. And the problem here is that the UN has not stepped in other cases where it needed to. It has not condemned some of these dictators around the world. It has not been effective in stopping Russia's invasion of Ukraine, for example. So it has lost a lot of credibility. But nonetheless, there will be a platform that they use to criticize the United States for this move.
Both the Biden administration and the Trump administration did not recognize Maduro as the legitimate president. Should there be any issue with his removal since he...
So thinking back to the point in the chat that YouTube now holds creators accountable for off-platform behavior by people who follow them, we affect other people, right? So to what degree should we hold ourselves accountable for how we influence other people? Painful question. And other people have agency, but we can influence things. Ouch. Okay, so Trump is treating Venezuela like a distressed asset in receivership that needs a new management team to fix the infrastructure and get the oil flowing, right? So Trump says we will run it, and this is a proxy for we will dictate the terms of the cleanup, right? It's not some commitment to long-term administration, and the media just takes his words literally, right? They're missing that his ownership language is transactional. It's not political. It's not literal. So based on the Gaza example, we can expect that the U.S. running Venezuela phrase to be quite temporary, quite hands-off in practice. I don't think we're going to be investing a lot of troops and money in Venezuela. So this literal-mindedness that dominates the news media, right? It's not just annoying. It's some kind of structural blind spot that prevents the news from communicating what's truly happening. But I guess the news can't get sued when you take people literally. And so due to the business model of the news, it has to take people literally. But that just creates this huge gap between the news and reality. Plenty of people navigate reality very well, very effectively, even in a superior fashion to those who follow the news, right? There's absolutely no reason to follow the news just to navigate reality. So why does the MSM, right, the mainstream media, consistently fall into this trap, in particular with Donald Trump, in particular with issues like Venezuela and Gaza? So the famous statement here is by journalist Selena Zito. She says, the press takes Trump literally but not seriously. His supporters take him seriously but not literally. So Trump says the U.S. will run Venezuela. The media passes the verb run. You've got all these articles in the elite news right now, from the Financial Times to the New York Times. What does it mean for America to run Venezuela? Then they look for State Department white papers, right? Budget allocations for an occupation force and legal frameworks for annexation. Was this raid on Venezuela, was it legal, right? That's the first thing that the good, elevated, educated people ask. Was this legal? Is there anything that you hate more than an illegal war? Then when people don't find these white papers, right, they treat the statement as some kind of insane lie or an immediate moral global crisis, right? Let's go back to reality. Run means directional, not operational. Means that we are going to be the boss of the situation, or we will dictate terms. It is a claim of dominance. It's not a policy white paper. And then we've got this whole fact-checking industrial complex where you have all these fact-checkers in the elite media trying to catch politicians who lie by omission or use slippery legal language like Bill Clinton. And this whole apparatus is not so well built for a politician like Trump who speaks in directional hyperbole. Yeah, the news media should check facts. If a CEO says we are buying this company, right, financial reporters have to treat this as a literal acquisition event. There are times you want to take people literally and times you want to take people seriously and times you want to do neither. So we should probably apply this same standard to Trump. The news feels like if it doesn't report what he says literally, then they are normalizing him. And so they fact-check a metaphor, we will own Gaza, we will run Venezuela, right, as if it were a real estate deal. And then that makes the news look hysterical when the bulldozers never show up. And Trump loves to use strategic ambiguity, right? He benefits from this literal interpretation by saying all these extreme things like the U.S. will run Venezuela. He achieves two things, right? He anchors the conversation, right? He shifts the window of conversation. So heavy sanctions or installing a friendly government, right, by comparison to annexing or running Venezuela or making it the 51st state, right? These other alternatives now seem moderate. And his supporters here, America First dominance. His critics here, imperial colonialism. So the media will run around in circles trying to pin down the literal meaning, but the emotional message has probably already landed with his target audience. So this is a problem that I've often had. All right, I like to take things literally, but particularly the women in my life, but just as often the men, right? It's often the emotional meaning of words that is more important to them than the literal meaning. I quite like a lot of the analysis by this bloke, Paul Warburg, right? He seems highly educated, elite, seems to be coming from a buffered perspective where international global norms, international law, and what's the moral thing to do seems to dominate his thinking. So he's a little bit detached from reality, but let's give him a shot.
Just surprised essentially everybody by capturing the president of Venezuela, Nicolás Maduro, overnight, while at least in the Western Hemisphere, most of us were all asleep in our beds. And obviously the implications of this are...
The first question to ask when you hear that we raided Venezuela is, did Donald Trump follow the proper process, man? Did he check all the boxes?
Huge, and as usual, they go far, far beyond what was stated in the official press release. And so because of that, I now have the distinctive pleasure of commenting on what is almost certain to be one of the most divisive issues of 2026, and it's not even January 5th yet. I mean, come on, guys. This is a topic that's very complex, and it's multi-layered, and because it's multi-layered, it is a topic where no matter what I say, a large number of people are going to disagree.
Yes, it is complex. It is multi-layered, but I meditated before I launched this stream, so I'm ready to take on the complexity.
Agree with me on at least one point. And so because of that, I'm not really going to worry about what people think. I'm not going to try to take a side. And actually, it turns out that my thinking, it is not even fully developed for myself.
I'd say 99.9% of the time when people announce that they're not going to worry about what other people say, that they are deluded.
Yet on where I land on every single one of the pieces. There is, of course, first the most basic piece of Nicolás Maduro actually being ousted, and whether or not that's a good thing for Venezuela and for the broader world. And I would, of course, say because of who Nicolás Maduro was, he was a dictator who killed thousands of people. He was so brutal that actually 20% of his population fled the country to get away from him. Obvious.
So we think many different ways. We think cognitively, we think with our prefrontal cortex, but we also think with our body. And I want to be honest. I want to tell you what's going on with my body, and my body freaking loves this, right? My body loves the second Trump administration. My body is just excited. That doesn't mean I support it. That doesn't mean that I think that Trump is doing the right thing. That doesn't mean that there's not a crisis of competence. But you should notice what's going on with your body, and you see this in the news. The news reporters covering this story are incredibly excited. Their body loves it too. So my body is just thrilled with the second Trump administration because there's just so many fascinating, interesting things to think about and talk about. And my body just loved that Trump bombed Iran's nuclear facilities, and my body just loves that Trump did this unilateral intervention in Venezuela and took out Maduro. So it's exciting and it's thrilling, and I'm into it. I'm fascinated. Doesn't mean I think it's a good idea, right? That's a different part of me. So I've meditated, right? I've recognized what's going on with my body, and according to this Daniel Siegel Wheel of Awareness meditation exercise, getting in touch with what's going on in the interior of your body can be a deep source of wisdom.
This is one piece where I think it is a net good that Nicolás Maduro has been ousted. I can say that unequivocally. But where things get more complex is the other pieces, not just the mere fact that he was ousted, but how he was ousted, and maybe more importantly, why he was ousted, which at least at this point does not seem to match the
So remember when Trump bombed Iran's nuclear facilities, was it June, July of this year? And I'm what might be the knock-on effects? And my various ChatGPT AI chatbots told me you shouldn't expect dramatic knock-on effects, but I think there could be some dramatic knock-on effects now from the Trump bombing of Iran's nukes, and now Trump taking out Maduro. So if I were Greenland, I'd start thinking about what kind of price I want. If I were Denmark, I'd start thinking about what kind of price I want for Greenland. If I were China or Russia, I'd be annoyed because Maduro just met with China's representatives and signed hundreds and hundreds of deals just a few hours before Trump took out Maduro. Iran, Russia, China all benefit from the corrupt Venezuela regime that seems to have been taken out by Trump. What about Mexico? You've got drug cartels that certainly seem to be running at least a third of the country. And if I were a drug cartel in Mexico right now, I'd be nervous. If I were the leader of Mexico right now, I would be nervous. Trump said that the president of Colombia has to watch his ass because he's in some massive cocaine narco trafficking regime. I mean, we live in very exciting times.
Official narrative. The data doesn't match the official narrative for why he was ousted, and that's something I'll get into later in this video. That puts me in a tough position, but what I want to acknowledge is that two things can be true at once. First of all, it can be a net good for the world to get rid of a dictator like Maduro. And what's important to look at here is not our personal like or dislike.
Wait, can something be good if it doesn't follow the approved process? Can something be good if all the boxes weren't checked? Is it even possible for something to be good if it challenges or even, God forbid, violates international law? Or what if the United Nations doesn't approve? Can something be good under those circumstances? And then what's another reason why the media takes Trump's words so literally? They fear underreacting, right? So the media in 2015 and 2016 frequently treated Donald Trump like a joke. That he won the Republican nomination, right? I had friends who told me, oh, I know things you don't know. There's no way that Trump will be allowed to win the Republican nomination. And so as an overcorrection to treating Trump as a joke, they now treat his every syllable as some kind of papal binding edict, right? They are terrified that the one time they dismiss a comment as just rhetoric or a joke will be the time he actually does something. So we have a boy who cried wolf dynamic where every statement from Trump is treated now as a DEFCON 1 emergency. So I suspect running Venezuela means controlling the oil flow and dominating the political transition. I don't think that we're going to have thousands of American troops on the ground running things.
Of the United States and the Trump administration who carried out this attack and actually captured Maduro. But what's important to look at is the people who are celebrating this event and the people who are upset about this event. And one thing that has been very clear to me as I've been watching this is that people who are celebrating this event tend to be Venezuelan citizens or Venezuelan expats who fled the Maduro regime. There's been a lot of videos of people celebrating the fact that Maduro has been ousted, and these are Venezuelans, the people who are the most directly affected by this. And the people who are upset about this most vocally have been people like Russia and China, and that itself tells us something from a geopolitical perspective. Obviously, these are countries that in the West we don't take very seriously. Russia has invaded Ukraine. They don't really have cause to be self-righteous. China's done terrible things to their own people within their own country, and they always talk about taking over Taiwan very vocally and explicitly. And we can kind of use Occam's razor, and we could say, if these two countries are both upset about something, that thing itself is probably a good thing. And indeed, Maduro was a brutal man. He ousted so many people. He took power by force.
Okay, we've got a comment here on X. Spare a thought today for highly respected analyst Professor John Mearsheimer explaining how it wouldn't be possible for U.S. military forces to capture Maduro in Venezuela. He's been consistently wrong on everything he says about the Middle East.
And I think that, you can talk about maybe sending in special forces teams that can decapitate the regime.
I think everyone was wrong about this. No one predicted that Trump would actually invade and take out Maduro, except for one person who made a very large bet on it on Friday.
Or using air power or naval power to coerce Venezuela. But when you look carefully at these options, they don't spell success either. First of all, Maduro is going to be very hard to get at. He knows you're coming after him, and he's going to do everything he can to hide. And I think that,
So out of all the geopolitical talking heads, I noticed John Mearsheimer is very quick to talk about when he's wrong, to admit when he's wrong, to point out flaws in his model. So I think he's an excellent example for a public intellectual. Eric Zemmour in France says Maduro's capture recalls three truths. Force has never left geopolitics, so the dreamers can put away their stuffed animals. It is useless to jump up and down in one's chair like a goat shouting sovereignty. The duty of a statesman is to make his country a strong country so as not to be the one attacked. Right, because Israel showed weakness, it was attacked on October 7, 2023. Immigration and drugs are wars waged against us without declaration. Just because we refuse war doesn't mean others won't wage it on us. One of my favorite political scientists is Darrell E. Paul. He wrote a book about how elites installed gay marriage as the great moral litmus test of our age. He says the U.S. coup d'etat in Venezuela puts Trump's Ukraine policy in an important context. The international community is out. The great powers and their legitimate spheres of influence are in. If I lived in Taiwan now, I would be worried. 5 years ago, under Biden, our government declared war on Delta, combat controllers, Air Force, Special Forces, Navy SEALs, not to mention pilots in the Air Force, Navy, and Army for being too white. DEI was to eliminate opportunities for white men. Okay, maybe we'll debunk Candace Owens' views on the Talmud a little later. Yeah, who's your Chinese peptide dealer? According to the New York Times, Chinese peptides are the latest biohacking trend in the U.S. Aaron Wren says people are taking peptides for a simple reason. They work, and they are cheap. But the FDA hasn't approved them, guys. Don't take anything that the FDA hasn't approved. It's almost a crime that these aren't readily, officially available in the U.S. and probably never will be. This is interesting. Why the snatching of Maduro is great for America. 9 reasons why this is great for America. Okay, let's give this column a shot. By J. Michael Waller, American Greatness. Took out the head of a major international organized crime cartel. Took out the leader who flooded the United States with hardened criminals, organized terrorist groups, and millions of refugees. Took out the leader of an international terror organization, took out the sponsor of Hezbollah and other jihadis on our southern maritime border, took out the sponsor of Iranian surveillance and kamikaze drones on our southern maritime border, took out a major supply of cash to the Iranian forces responsible for killing hundreds of Americans, deprived communist China of plans to deploy its navy around Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas, and the Panama Canal, restored and modernized our 200-year Monroe Doctrine, and it did all this without a single loss of an American life. All right, those strike me as pretty good things.
He was widely not considered to be legitimate. He brought the nation of Venezuela to economic ruin. 20% of his population fled from him, and thousands of people were killed by him, including some people that I know by association personally some people who came to the United States because, for example, their parents were killed by Maduro. So that is something that can be true. It can be a net good that Maduro is gone, while simultaneously it's possible to be concerned or upset about the way it happened, and it's also possible to be suspicious about how things have happened. And this is at least...
Seriously, what kind of person is upset about the way it happened, right? I can't see a strong evolutionary reproductive reason why you'd be more likely to reproduce your genes if you get upset about the process by which the President of the United States took out the leader of Venezuela. Therefore, if something doesn't make any evolutionary sense, what's going on is not what people say. So when people are upset about the process that Trump used to take out Maduro, they're not upset about the process that Trump used to take out Maduro, because that would be a maladaptive evolutionary strategy, and it just simply wouldn't reproduce itself over generations. What's going on is a status play. You have a tiny group of elites trying to fight for status, and that's what I'm engaged in right now. I'm trying to show that I am smarter than those elites, right? I am playing a status game. There's a tiny number of people for whom I want to climb in their status by sharing wise commentary. So I'm not above status games, but when you hear the elite bemoan the lack of appropriate process here for this invasion, when you hear the elite bemoan how this violates international law, because there is no evolutionary adaptive reproductive advantage for taking these type of positions, what's going on is not that they're really concerned about any of these things. They're simply playing a status game. And the way that you try to gain status among the foreign policy establishment in the blob is by being as abstract from reality as possible, to be as buffered as possible, and to look at this primarily in terms of process and international law, and to be just wildly removed from reality, which strikes me as kind of a weird thing to venerate, right? Why would you think that this is the smart way to go? What he's talking about is interesting, but he is propounding a type of thinking that is anti-adaptive, anti-evolutionary, anti-reproductive. It is a play for status.
At least in day one, things can obviously change, but this is sort of my position, where at the very least I'm very suspicious about what has happened, because it seems that while it's a net good that Maduro is removed, this is actually a pretext for what has happened and not a reason. And the reason I'm saying that is because, having watched the press release and the items that were focused on the most, what was focused on the most was not the good of the Venezuelan people. It wasn't the brutality of the Maduro regime. Those things were mentioned and they were given lip service to.
So is there a good evolutionary adaptive reproductive reason to be worried primarily about the good of the people of Venezuela if you are an American? No, unless you have family there, unless they are part of your extended family, there's no good evolutionary adaptive reproductive advantage. Therefore, what you're really worried about is your status, right? You are engaged in BS. When you're engaged in BS, it doesn't mean you're deliberately lying. It means that truth is irrelevant to what you're doing. It's a status play. So one great thing about this raid on Venezuela is that we get a lot of good video out of it, right? A lot of exciting video. So let's count our blessings. Right. The most exciting, interesting news publication that has just vaulted to the top over the past year with more and more exciting, interesting stories is the Wall Street Journal. Right, it got a new editor about 2 years ago, and it is just consistently bringing the most important stories to the fore. And they have this columnist on Latin America, Mary Anastasia O'Grady. And you're wondering, what does O'Grady think about what's next for Venezuela? So it's interesting that Venezuela's armed forces haven't mobilized. It's interesting the Democratic opposition hasn't called its supporters to the streets. Right? You don't have tanks rolling. You don't have brigades marching, right? The nation's under attack. Why isn't this happening? And you have Trump telling Colombia's leader, Colombia's president that he could be next, right, to watch his ass. And the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, tells the Cuban regime that they should be sleeping with one eye open. Right, that's hilarious. So what the hell's going on, right? What is likely to be next for Venezuela? So we have the pragmatists, right? We have the new leader, Delcy Rodriguez, who is not in Venezuela. We have a defense minister, Vladimir Pedrino. They are viewed as potential pivots, potential pragmatists. So America appears to be trying to coerce them into a negotiated transition to avoid prison and to avoid getting killed. Then we have the hardliners, right? The ruthless ones who are in hiding, who represent the primary obstacle to police, right? These are the people who you'd think would try to mobilize street protests and violence. So how big is this disconnect between America's military actions and President Trump's rhetoric? So you have the dominant number of our elites, certainly of the neoconservative variety, who support taking out Maduro, but they only want it done to promote democracy. So why are so many people just so hung up with promoting democracy and promoting human rights, and have the United States just intervening all over the world? Now, if you are cynical, right, if you're some kind of anti-Semite, you're going to claim that they're just doing this for Israel, that they want a highly interventionist American foreign policy promoting democracy as an excuse for promoting their tribal interests. And this just shows that you are a bad person.
I did not have us invading Venezuela on my, bingo card ever, including the fact that we have been seeking to do something about the illegitimate regimes of Hugo Chavez and Maduro.
I do not support Maduro, but I have to be honest. I once met Maduro in the cliffs at Bondi Beach. It was late one night, and we started talking about international human rights, and I often disagreed with the things he said, but I got to give it to the bloke. He had a smile that would just light up a room, and he still got that.
Maduro pretty much since 2012, but that we would actually take military action that involved boots on the ground in the capital of Caracas, beyond my imagining. So here we are. It's happened, and we have, I think, three.
Press 2 if you are upset that we may have violated international law and we didn't follow the proper elite-approved process.
Things to discuss, one of which is the military and strategic message that was delivered by this action. The second is the political fallout or benefit that will be gathered by Donald Trump, his team, the Republicans, or by the Democrats. And third, a sense of the strategic picture of the globe in the wake of this.
So I don't agree with the Commentary Magazine crew about very much, but I got to hand it to them. They're consistently interesting. I think every one of them is considerably more intelligent than I am. They are really good at this podcast thing.
Remarkable action, which I think has potentially astounding ramifications. So I just want to start with the military, because the thing that blew me away this morning in the long press conference statements by Trump and by Pete Hegseth and by Marco Rubio, and then particularly was the statement by General Kane, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, in describing the mission. And his description of the mission was awesome, and awesome in ways that I think have very...
So you're also wondering, 40, what else is your body excited about these days? Your body is experiencing love, right? It is transcended lust to that realm of true love. Your body's excited about taking out of Maduro, but 40, I need more. What else are you excited about? You're not excited about the Dallas Cowboys, another losing season, apparently another year out of the playoffs, but I'm excited by these protests in Iran. My body would freaking love a major regime change in Iran. Now, my mind thinks when Trump tells the leaders of Iran, if you hurt a hair on the head of these protesters, the United States is locked and loaded to take you out. Right? My body loves that, but my mind thinks that may not be good because it might encourage all sorts of protests that get people killed that perhaps would not be killed if you didn't engage in that sort of rhetoric. And sure, the Iranian regime is bad, but what if Iran fell into chaos? What if things got worse by promoting an intervention there? So yeah, my body is all about new regime for Iran. Let's take down the mullahs. My prefrontal cortex says not so fast.
That have major ramifications. I keep using the word ramifications. 150 aircraft were involved, many of them flying 100 feet above the ocean surface in order to evade any detection. Apparently, Trump said we knocked out.
So if you're a good person, right, the only reason that you support this kind of intervention is because you are primarily concerned about the good of the people of Venezuela, right? So it was very bad from this perspective for Trump to dismiss the opposition, Maria Corina Machado. He claimed that she was not respected. And we have the Wall Street Journal assuring us that she is wildly popular and she is a Nobel Peace Prize winner. And she is the unifying force for the country. So what if Trump said that she's not respected because he has some kind of latent misogyny or sexism going on? Right. So Democratic opposition has not mobilized their supporters yet. They're not out on the streets. The U.S. security footprint not particularly visible right now. But you'll be glad to know the Wall Street Journal columnist has told us that Trump has the moral high ground for enforcing the will of the Venezuelan people. Whew. And she approves of the warning sent to Colombia and to Cuba. And she warns us against repeating the U.S. mistake in Iraq of completely dismantling the military. She says the Venezuelan army, they need to be part of the solution. And she critiques Trump for focusing on oil and on drugs and not mentioning the more than 900 political prisoners currently in danger of retaliation. And she views the phrase run the country as unsettling. She's concerned that U.S. forces are insufficient to enforce the law and order if the regime's paramilitary gangs activate. And she says this removal of Maduro is only the first and perhaps the easiest step, and that the success of this operation hinges on convincing the Venezuelan military to switch sides rather than to fight, and to empower Machado and to restore democracy. So it's interesting. All the elite analysis, it focuses on moral principles and legal principles much more than on American interests. And as it's obviously maladaptive evolutionary pattern for American elites to be primarily focused on principles of legality and morality with regard to Venezuelans, so they're engaged in BS and not really telling us what they're about. They're engaged in status plays, right? Just as I blog and vlog so much for so little tangible benefit because I am making a play for status as well. So our elites prioritize these abstract universal principles of morality and legality over concrete particulars of national interest. So the elites are operating with some kind of hidden or latent social function quite different from the manifest content. So in sociological terms, you're wondering, 40, what would a sociologist say about this? Right? If you're primarily interested in America's interests, you are particularistic, you are tribal, you're nationalist, you favor one specific group, your nation, over others. Right? This is primitive, this is instinctual, this is low status in the globalized hierarchy. The high status thing is to focus on principles and legality. That's the universalist, globalist outlook, right? You need to be buffered. You need to be abstract. You need to have an elite higher education. You need to be detached from immediate tribal loyalty, right? You need to speak with this universalist, globalist stance. And that signals that you belong to the cognitive and educational elite. And you need to understand these issues as complex legal and moral puzzles that the ordinary people can never understand. You need to exclude from the discourse those who view politics through the simpler lens of, is this good for us? These nationalists and tribalists and just these petty, backward people still clinging to their guns and religion, right? We need status closure here, people. We need to fence off this conversation and just keep it to the credentialed elite class, right? So if you want to make some kind of costly signal in nature, right, you do that to prove how fit you are, because it's a handicap, like a big peacock's tail, right? You want to show that you have such an excess of resources that you can waste them on something useless. And so arguing for all sorts of globalized, legalized principles that harm American national interests, right, that is a social signal. You're telling people, I am so secure, I am so resource rich that I can afford to prioritize abstract principles of morality over the best interests of my nation. And this shows that you're high status, but it's obviously maladaptive for the collective, right? And so we have a leadership class, particularly in the foreign policy establishment, that is way too detached from the survival imperatives of the host population, right? If the peacock tail becomes too resource heavy, the bird gets eaten. So the predictive power of the commentary coming from the blob is not so great, right? If you were interested in the reality of what's best for America, right, that's low status, but you're operating from within reality. Engage in this abstract moral legal analysis and putting that first, right? That is just a kind of peacock's tail display.
Electricity in Caracas through an ability we have, he said, quote unquote. And they landed at 1 a.m. Or something like that, and they were out basically with Maduro.
They got to Maduro's compound around 1 a.m. Not quite clear when they got to the country. Yeah,
but it was like 2.5 hours, and Maduro was taken, and his wife was taken and arrested. And
so the more globalized, the more abstract you can frame your concerns, the more they depend upon intellectual principles, all right, then that just shows how high status you are, right? And most people live porous lives, right? The Buffett identity is a fiction, a useful fiction at times, but a fiction. In reality, we're all vulnerable, we're all porous, we're all constantly affected by what's going around us, and we all should have an interest in the national interest and in our tribal interest, right? We're all open to the world and vulnerable. We're susceptible to the forces of nature, of violence, of crime, crop failure, disease, right? When you recognize the porous reality, right, you cannot afford to live in abstraction, right? The normal person is hyper-focused on reality, survival, and their concrete interest because a mistake will likely kill you. They don't have the abundant resources that allows them to engage in the luxuries of the fictional Buffett self, right? Where you've got so much wealth, you've got the institutions behind you, you've got the technology under control, you've got a bureaucracy that protects you, you've got all these forces between you and raw reality. And so you can afford to absorb the shocks of bad policy and of social decay, and it's not dangerous to you because you are in a state of luxury. You're in a state of privilege, right? You don't have to worry about survival interests. You are free to worry about abstract global principles. Now, when you recognize the porous nature of reality, and you recognize that if you adopt a maladaptive belief, right, the tiger wants to be my friend, reality is likely to correct you immediately and painfully and possibly fatally. But in the Buffett world of our elite, much of the feedback loop is severed, but not so severed that they didn't lose control and have Donald Trump elected president 2 of the last 3 elections. So if you're elite, you can champion all sorts of policies that destroy the working class, that compromise national security, that are bad for America, right? But because you live in luxury and in privilege and in a gated community and you work in a secure sector, you don't feel the sting. So all these bad ideas, maladaptive ideas, can survive indefinitely in the upper strata because the people holding these bad ideas don't have to pay the price for being wrong, right? Abstraction is the ultimate luxury goods because it shows that you've solved all the physical problems of existence. So focusing on global interests and global principles, right, that is high status because it's a luxury focus on American interests and tribal interests and group interests and your own interests, right? That shows that you're low status, right? If you are obsessed with global legality, you live in a post-scarcity, post-conflict mindset, right? You are saying, my world's so stable, so safe, so luxurious, so protected that I can afford to play referee for the entire planet rather than fighting for my own people. And so we have a whole expert class of people who mistake their insulation from reality for superior moral insight.
And they were out and they were landing on, American ship to be taken to Stewart Airport in northern Westchester County to be brought to Brooklyn. I think either Manhattan or Brooklyn.
Via Gitmo.
Thank you. Yes. Okay. So 150 aircraft, total strategic surprise. Astounding. This is the second jaw-dropping, astounding American military mission in the last 8 months, or even shorter. I can't even remember when the Iran strike was now. Maybe 6 months. Also, total strategic surprise, complete wild success of the mission itself as defined precisely for the day of the mission. So we obviously have unambiguously a military that so far surpasses anything that anybody else.
So my favorite political commentator for more than 20 years is Mark Halperin, and he writes a column for the Daily Mail. And I lashed out and spent money to subscribe to the Daily Mail simply so I could read Mark Halperin's commentary. And it wasn't to get all the latest in celebrity gossip. So Trump was on Fox and Friends early Saturday morning. Like he was fielding calls from the New York Times at 4:30 a.m. And he was confident. He was giddy. He was delighted by the awesome power of the American military. And that just shows how low status he is. This is the same bloke who likes decorating in gold, man. That's low status. To be delighted by the awesome power of the American military, that's not high status. So Trump has this showman's relish. Like, he loved telling the story of the capture of Nicolás Maduro and his wife, right? Trump was genuinely in awe, not of himself, which is rare, but of the sheer capability of the American armed forces that he's now deploying with startling regularity. And then it was just hilarious to watch the media's split screen trance. So half the time, the media was gorging on the gee whiz operational details of the mission, how fast it was, how few shots were fired, who gave what order, whether the Maduros and their security detail put up any resistance. Then the other half of the media coverage was spent furrowing their brows and proclaiming that Americans should be worried about legal authority, international precedent, whether this was appropriate, right? The press loves a good Hollywood-style raid, but it loves berating Donald Trump even more. So there is a Trump doctrine. There's an evolving Trump military doctrine. Doesn't look like Bush-Obama-era prolonged drips of force. Looks more like a series of smash and grab lightning strikes. Use overwhelming U.S. power. Have few, if any, American casualties. And have the victims be really bad guys. So White House is insisting this Maduro snatch, it was about the drugs. But as soon as Trump talks about the story, you can see it's really about oil, 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 and American interests. And also interesting how much Trump trusts his generals and how much he respects them. And he talks a big game, but his military playbook is minimal, right? Be fast, get in, get out, right? Wham, bam, thank you, ma'am. And then move straight into the aftermath with chest-thumping grandeur. It's like, why do Australian men make love so quickly so they can get down to the pub and tell their mates about it? So we've had decades of U.S. presidents hesitating, equivocating, convening endless debates about this or that, right? Trump basically acts from his gut. And now you've got every dictator, right, from Caracas to Managua to Havana, on notice that America's kinetic tools are not just ceremonial, they can come off the shelf quickly. Beijing and Moscow notice that in America's neighborhood, in the Western Hemisphere, right, they should keep their distance. And American officials are now speaking about taking over Cuba and Greenland, where Trump is going to apparently redraw long, ambiguous lines of influence. So it's not that Trump is resurrecting the Monroe Doctrine. He's updating it with cruise missiles, with cable news cadence, with stunning visuals. I mean, he published a video shortly after the raid with like pop music and flashy visuals. He's all about dominating natural resources such as oil. Right? So Trump is defining what MAGA is. Right? MAGA doesn't define Trump. Trump defines MAGA. And it's now MAGA to be engaging in these military attacks overseas. Trump loves victory. Right? And he loves standing with American public opinion, right? Normal Americans not concerned about whether this was illegal or unwise or didn't check all the boxes or if this was executive overreach or if this violated congressional prerogatives, right? Trump welcomes this fight, right? He knows that ordinary Americans are not lying awake at night, mourning encroachment on the separation of powers or the violation of international norms, right? This was clean, swift, successful. This was pure American strength. Trump seizes another headline. It's hilarious, man.
What else has on earth that we need to just take a moment to step back and say, wow. I wrote a piece in June called We Are Awesome, which was really about America and why people should not be anti-American. But I mean, we are awesome. This was awesome.
But particularly, look, it's the Night Stalker, it's the helicopter group that you described. The Delta Force, which we should also always remind ourselves is incredible. But we also obviously had a CIA asset very close to Maduro to coordinate with those military assets so that we knew exactly where he was and where he could be picked up with the least loss of life, not only for our own soldiers, but for those surrounding him. It really was extraordinary.
You know, but I should say, you know, this reminded me that U.S. military was awesome long before this. Like, under any president, if you recall the Abbottabad raid that killed Osama bin Laden, unbelievable intelligence gathering, unbelievable. Modeled doing it on a fake structure for months in advance, went in, knew the layout of the place.
So remember the phrase, Trump always chickens out, taco? Right? Not so funny anymore, right? What if Trump was so annoyed by that phrase that he bombed Iran's nuclear reactors and took out Maduro? So the elite embraced taco. Trump always chickens out. It was coined by the Financial Times in May of 2025. But that narrative is collapsing, right? Capturing a head of state such as Nicolás Maduro without congressional notification is the polar opposite of chickening out. So the taco framework provided tremendous emotional comfort for people who hated Donald Trump and for people who wanted to believe that all his threats were just negotiating tactics. They were never actionable plans. So it's always worth asking, like, why do we love a phrase? Why do we love an idea? Why does a particular text or a particular podcast bring us comfort, right? It's meeting vital emotional needs that do not necessarily correlate with reality.
In, out, got him, dumped him at sea, no American casualties. And again, by the way, no American casualties in this. These things done in hours now. Hours, not days. When the U.S. invaded Panama to get Noriega, that took days. There were weeks
and remember,
of fighting.
He fled in like a Hyundai with his mistress and like stopped at the Dairy Queen and like then they got him and they had to blast Guns N' Roses at him for at the Holy
days.
See.
I think it was 5 days. That was 19. Right, that was 1990. That was literally or the end of 1990, early 1990, almost exactly to this anniversary date.
Right.
Dave, I think your point is important because this wasn't just a military feat. It was like a dazzling partnership of our intelligence.
So remember during the Israel-Iran war and particularly in the run-up and the aftermath of Trump joining in and bombing Iran's nuclear facilities, how our foreign policy establishment told us that if America intervenes, it will just make the mullahs stronger. Well, the mullahs don't seem so strong anymore. But here's a man who is strong, right? We got Michael. He's a strong man. What's going on, bro?
Mental toughness. That is my life philosophy. So I'm enjoying your analysis so far of this whole situation. And, the funniest thing is how Trump just came out and said, we're going to run Venezuela right now until they figure it out.
Sorry, go ahead.
And, I have to think he's doing it to deliberately provoke people, and he thinks it's funny, and I think it's funny. But he does that all the time. He tends to say things in a blunt way, as everybody knows. For example, he'll say things like, the Democrats are crazy. Like, we need to arrest the Democrats. Or he'll say something like that. he'd be like, Obama, like, you know, he'll just come out and say, like, we need to arrest the people like my political opponents. And the media will say, aha, like, we got you. You said the thing you're not supposed to say. And he did. But then he won't necessarily do that, you know? Whereas the Democrats are very slick and everything they say is kind of carefully curated, but then they'll actually go do that. They'll go do what Trump says that he wants to do.
Yes, you can get away with so much if you speak the code. And so fellow elites speak a particular code, and they can then get away with a whole bunch of stuff because they speak about things in a particular way. Trump breaks the code, and so it doesn't go over well with the elites.
Yes. So he said, for the time being, the vice president is allowed to be in charge. I guess she's president now of Venezuela. And then there's the freedom fighter lady who is in exile, Machado. Trump said she's not respected, so she can't be the leader. Which
That's
I think
hilarious.
Is yeah. So I'm trying to figure out what is the angle there, and the Machado is compared to Margaret Thatcher. Like, she's very into privatizing everything, and her number one beef with Maduro is that the state took over all the private industry. So you would think that the United States would rather like someone of that cast of mind.
Yeah. I mean, I was shocked when Trump said that because he has every social incentive to praise this woman. She's a Nobel Peace Prize winner. Everybody from the left to the right praises her and wants to promote her. It was shocking to hear him put her down like that.
You know, and just, you know, quickly doing a little research, it seems like she might be a little bit of a leftist, but I don't know, maybe I'm sure Trump knows something that we don't know in terms of her not being someone who would like to collaborate in every sense of the word collaborate.
Yeah, and people have to be tough enough to have to deal with Trump and his put down. So if, for example, she wasn't tough enough to navigate Trump putting it down like this, then she certainly couldn't be tough enough to run a country. But it's just so counterintuitive what he said about her.
Yeah. But fortunately, there's really no talk of democracy. I know that sounds kind of ironic to say, but we all know the context being our adventures in the early 2000s, trying to liberate different countries, Afghanistan, Iraq in particular. So we're not talking about democracy, so that's good. Actually, that goes back to FDR saying that we're going to be the arsenal of democracy. That was a phrase he used before we entered World War II.
Yeah.
So we're not the arsenal of democracy.
Yeah. But that is the primary concern of our foreign policy establishment. All the elites are primarily concerned about process, legality, and what they call democracy.
Yes. But it would seem, I think like you, I'm kind of ambivalent about whether this is good or not. I'm not going to try to be like John Mearsheimer and pretend to prognosticate everything. But it is interesting that there's kind of a confluence of reasons why we're doing this. And I think the stated reasons are relatively noble. Sorry, are you hearing that car alarm?
Yes, but
okay,
I hear the moral profundity of your words even more clearly than the alarm.
Yeah, okay. So let me just restate. There's a confluence of reasons apparently why we did this, all of which are relatively noble, one of which is the Monroe Doctrine. And you hear Trump say, yeah, like the Monroe Doctrine is really important. Like, it's a really big thing, the Monroe Doctrine. And some people are calling it the Donroe Doctrine. And you kind of get the idea, like someone literally just explained to him like 2 weeks ago, what is the Monroe Doctrine? But
yes,
but so be it. It is a valid kind of lens with which to look at foreign policy. Certainly, a country in our hemisphere is more relevant than one across the Pacific Ocean or the Atlantic Ocean. Although, actually, if you look at a map, Venezuela is not really that close to us. It's not in Central America; it's in South America. But nonetheless, that could be a problem if China is having bases there. Fentanyl was another reason, and I think Trump's concern about fentanyl is genuine. So many working class people are dying. It seems like the Democrats, I don't want to say the Democrats like the fentanyl crisis, but it seems like they're not especially perturbed by it.
And so many repercussions could come from this. I mean, this makes American strike on Mexico drug cartels much more likely, makes it much more likely that the U.S. will tip over the Cuban regime, might make it more likely that the U.S. will get Greenland. If Trump pulls this off, right, he will be emboldened.
Yes. So, originally I didn't really have a hot take on this, but now I find I do have a hot take. And it basically comes down to what I do in the Michael M. History Channel is me and my team, we read the details of news reports and we break stories. So here's the question. So Trump's, one of his stated reasons is that Maduro is supposedly moving drugs into the United States. Do you believe that's true?
Yeah, but I'm not sure it's a huge amount. It wouldn't shock me if it was under 10% of drugs in the U.S.
Okay. Well, so here's what's been reported, at least according to U.S. prosecutors, the Maduro administration has been complicit in moving drugs into the United States. And so Maduro's wife had a relationship with a drug trafficker and set up a meeting with literally the drug czar of Venezuela. So the drug czar is purportedly the person that's trying to prevent drugs, I would think. But in this case, he met with a drug trafficker and accepted a bribe of $100,000 for each flight carrying cocaine. Let me quote from CBS News. The trafficker arranged a bribe to Torres, that's the drug czar, $100,000 per flight to ship cocaine, prosecutors allege. So the drug czar is actually facilitating drugs.
And that's shocking. But seriously, here's a revelation that I had a few years ago. I watched this Colombian TV 85-part series on Pablo Escobar. And prior to watching the series, I just had contempt for people engaged in the drug trade. And then by watching the series, I got to kind of feel or experience vicariously what life was like for people in Colombia. And I recognized the reality that people don't care about outgroups. And so if Colombians can make money selling drugs to the United States, why would they not do that? It's in their vital interest. And if they can make their life easier and more prosperous selling something to Americans, why would we expect them to do otherwise? So it also, if you're faced with a choice between accepting money from drug cartels or putting your life at risk, what normal person would prefer to put their life at risk and refuse money? So given the incentives, it just surprises me that more people in Latin America don't actively participate and cooperate with drug cartels.
Yeah, they do. And it just goes to show you that, President Trump has a benevolent and almost a paternal attitude towards the American people because he genuinely cares about this problem. And the fentanyl aspect of it is what makes it so scary, is that you can do a little bit of drugs and die. So, and previous presidents, as I said, I used the word benevolent and paternal. It seems like, as I say, Biden, Democrats, do they care about fentanyl? I don't know if they do. So yeah, people are going to move drugs in the United States as long as there's an incentive to do it, until your president gets kidnapped, and then you might not. So I'll sign out with that 40 because something just came up. Cheers.
Okay, mate. Okay. Talk to you later. And Jamie says in the chat, Luke, a legend in his own mind. Luke is a joke. True, I am. I am a joke. I am a legend in my own mind. I have a delusional sense of my own wisdom and intelligence. And it is this delusion that drives me to do what I am doing right now. This is why I'm talking to you, because I have a vast overestimation of my own abilities. Now, you can take these kind of delusions about oneself and you can still channel them in pro-social ways. I know because Gemini, the AI chatbot, told me so.
Intelligence capabilities and our military capabilities. And Kane, I believe, talked about monitoring Maduro for months. This wasn't an in and out, but they were monitoring his movements and watching where he was, who he was with, and what his patterns of life were for months. And then in the days before the operation, waiting until conditions were right. Now, I don't quite know what they meant by that, but Rubio said we couldn't have notified Congress because we didn't know when this was going to happen, and it would have risked operational security to give notification when it could have been any day within a 2-week period. So it really was this perfect marriage of intelligence and a military operation.
Okay, I think we should.
So one reason that I'm a big Mark Halperin fan is that he roots for America, right? That is his hero system. He is pro-America, and he's about as disinterested and about as even-handed as I could expect from a journalist. And he has this patriotic pragmatism that feels extinct in modern commentary. The elite commentary is all about abstract, universal, global principles, morality, and international law and human rights. Mark Halperin really is America first. So most news coverage and most political commentary is all about heroes versus villains, right? And Trump is the villain. Everything he does is bad, even if it helps the country. And my elite buffered side is the hero, so all our failures must be ignored or spun. And Mark Halperin operates on a nation as client model, right? He treats Americans as his client. His job is not to tell you who to hate. It's to tell you what's happening, why it's happening, and what is the likelihood that what's happening is going to work. And Halperin's perspective, his pro-American pragmatism, is so different from the globalized, etherealized, abstract, buffered piety that otherwise dominates the elite news media. Right? Halperin respects reality. He respects the scoreboard. He roots for America. He acknowledges wins and losses, regardless of who wins and regardless of who loses. He admits that this military operation to seize Maduro was clean, swift, and successful. Right? A pious journalist would struggle to admit this because they would fear that complimenting Donald Trump would validate the bad man. And Halperin's loyalty is to America and to reality. Right? If the gas prices go down and the bad guy is in handcuffs, he marks this as a win for the American national interest. He doesn't see it as a moral endorsement of Donald Trump's soul. Halperin assumes that his American audience is pro-America. Right? The elite class writes as if their audience needs to be deprogrammed of their patriotism and their nationalism and their tribalism and their familyism. So our elite treat American power with great suspicion. Right? They instinctively don't like it unless it's deployed on behalf of universal, elite, moral, abstract, buffered principles. Right? Halperin writes with the assumption that Americans want America to be strong, safe, and prosperous, and he does not apologize for American power. Right? He talks about the awesome power of the American military. This aligns him with the normal American, who likes it when America wins. So Halperin analyzes politics like sports or high-stakes poker, right? He asks, was this a smart move? Did this leverage our assets? What's the counter move? It's refreshing because it lowers the temperature. Theology is non-negotiable, right? It's good versus evil, but game theory is rational. The elites talk about politics as though it were theology, and it's about good guys versus bad guys. But Halperin treats the Venezuela raid as a strategic play for oil and for influence. He uses game theory. He doesn't focus on violation of international norms, which treats theology as theology. So he enables people who listen to him and read him to think more clearly about whose interests are at stake and whose ox is gored. And by being cynical about motives and admitting that this move in Venezuela is largely about oil, Halperin is being optimistic about America. He implies that America is capable of defending its own interests, acting in its own interests, and succeeding in its pursuit of its own interests. Right? The pious elite news media coverage is likely to leave you feeling hopeless, that America is broken, that the voters are wrong, and our history is shameful. Right? Halperin consistently puts forward constructive critiques. Right? This is what's happening. Here it's going to change reality in this way, and it's just such a refreshing change from the elite, pious, theological perspective. Right? I just feel inundated with all these moralistic, globalistic, legalistic comments on politics.
I think we should start here. I mean, we've already started, but I mean, we should completely dispense with the notion that what happened here was an illegal action by the Trump administration. This follows a pattern that presidents have used for more than 40 years, dating back to the Grenada invasion in 1983, to Panama in 1989, to Bosnia in 1998, to the Abbottabad raid, to presidents who need to the Libya action where we led from behind, presidents who need to act and need to do so with operational security, act without prior notification of Congress. Now, if Congress were a different organization and we are...
Okay, Dooovid, let me see if I can hear you. How's it going, man? Oh, man, I don't know why. Oh, okay, great. I could hear you. So, good. So, do you have any reaction to the plethora of news these days?
Yeah, it's basically overwhelming in the sense of I can't reasonably think that. I mean, I know from like my parents or boomers or maybe you Jews are trying to hold on to some sort of larger narrative control of what appears to be things spiraling out of control. And, so now I'm just saying, okay, we have extreme uncertainty, kind of the things I'd been speculating and warning about for the last 10 years. And, from my mindset, just like, okay, like things are bad and they're getting worse, but, just how to deal with the information. How do you actually know what's going on? Even in your own country, the own news cycle, it's getting extremely difficult. And I mean, I could see different approaches of how to react to it, but I've kind of retreated like, okay, what do I know anyways? Is it really that important whether I actually understand what's happening in Israel or Venezuela?
Right, but you would only be here, like you would only be talking publicly if in your heart of hearts, underneath that, you believe that you did have something important to say.
Well, yeah, obviously. I mean, I have the ego. I mean, I still spend hours every day following the news. I understand the incentive structure. So although I think I have valuable insight or maybe a little keener, I mean, even a significantly keener understanding than other people, that there's no real platform, no way for me to develop a platform to, at least in the current incentive and structures, like there's no room for me as an influencer, even if I do have keen, true insights.
But it's like me, and there's no reason to believe that I have any future as an influencer. You and I, we each put tremendous amounts of time and effort into sharing our thoughts publicly.
Well, I mean, you more than me because I don't really stream my own content that often. It's only relatively when people ask me, and my streaming footprint has vastly decreased. And it's almost issue like if I'm brought on to be an anti-Zionist or kind of like traitor now at this point, or honest person on the Jews, but almost never is my insight on political issues, or even just to come on here because like, okay, like, I'm kind of a loner, I'm old, no one in real life takes me seriously, no one would even think to ask me like what my opinion is on any of these issues, or would I even have an opportunity to insert it in a normal conversation, except with maybe my mom. That like, yeah, I mean, it kind of feels good to come on streaming, even if not you pretending I'm going to be a great influencer, just to have like one person that is interested in what I'm saying or to kind of bounce ideas off of do we, are we accurately assessing the situation?
And are you able to tap into all the good things that come with this situation? Because it expands your freedom. you can follow what you believe to be true and right because you don't have delusions of grandeur. And so are you able to experience the good things that come from what you described as dire?
Yeah, I would put, my dad was asking me, I'm teaching in Detroit or, kind of like, and I said, like, honestly, people aren't really curious about me. And, the connection, that curiosity is correlated to IQ or I'm generally just curious. Like I research, I read, not necessarily thinking I'm going to have a valuable road, but I just kind of want to know and figure things out. And then, I did do a year in review of Church of Entropy, and you kind of heard normal feminine antics or something, whatever it was that was somewhat irritating to me, is saying like, well, when you trade stocks, like things are actually owned. She was talking about like AI and like, okay, she predicted these things. It was like, okay, what's your credit for having accurately predicted things? And the more value is ownership and ownership of stocks or companies, and saying what real use is there to information, to international trade and type things. And if you're a power player, it's really because you own things or because you have a position of power and you're speaking on behalf of other people. But your average person, other than curiosity, it's mostly delusion that would even drive a person to think that it's valuable for them to know all this information or have opinions about it.
So you said an interesting phrase as you started off today. You said you Jews. So you feel alienated from the Jewish community?
No, because I don't really have an identity other than being a dissident Jew. So I don't really see a practical way for me to reinvent myself other than, kind of the failed Jew I am. And I think with the current situation, that may actually play in my favor. And that's just saying like, okay, so I'm focusing mainly on things that are useful locally and knowing about global affairs, especially when there's no real interest in me being a pundit or something like that. And even here in Detroit, like I say, like local news programs, it's something they don't even talk much about local news. All they do is voice their opinions on national issues. So I'm generally trying to focus locally for these turbulent times, and assuming that I'm not going to be getting out, moving to Israel, taking my wealth, and so my state in these turbulent times are going to be through real local community relations. So in that sense, like I'm a Jewish dissident. I fully think that even American Jews are largely complicit in what's blatantly a genocide. But I'm still largely philo-Semitic, and I think in terms of task performance, even though your average Jew probably is, some level of complicity in this genocide, that like really they know what's happening and they want it to happen, that they're still relatively doing well in task performance. Like, the question of what about the Jewish doctors and Jewish dentists that are full Zionist, and I'm not sure if they're relatively the quality of their professionalism. I'm not sure if it's affected by these larger affairs. So in that, I think the Jewish community is relatively a safe bet, to maybe even the safest bet. I mean, obviously, if the rising anti-Semitism, we definitely talk about that. But I think just in terms of security, the Jewish community is definitely a secure, stable bet, especially if you're actually in a Jewish neighborhood of professionals.
So you're Jewish. You're saying that the Jewish state is engaged in genocide and that basically all Jews have some complicity in that. That is such an obviously evolutionarily, reproductively maladaptive thing to say or do. It's obviously a status play. So like me, right, I do this because I want status with a certain group of people. You do something that is obviously against your interests because there's a group of people from whom you want status as well. So from whom do you want status, or do you want me to go first?
Well, in the reality of like my anti-Zionist activism, yeah, I think there's really no status possible from doing it. It's a losing battle, maybe long run. I could see now, like if Israel ends up like losing and the bad guy maybe like, a guy I was right the whole time, but largely it's a signal to the Hasidic rabbis that educated me and that insisted this anti-Zionism, so I'm signaling, a bunch of Yiddish speaking rabbis that most people never heard of, don't care about, wouldn't even like if they knew who they were. But I'm signaling to them like I understood your teachings and I'm sticking with them, at least the anti-Zionist part. And also because I was brought up a universal humanist, or my parents, I have to be signaling to some sort of larger, I'm bound by some sort of larger moral system, even if it is detrimental to me. And most of my life being anti-Zionist has clearly been detrimental to me, other than maybe a few opportunities I was given in the Hasidic anti-Zionist world. But yeah, I think at some point I just decided decades ago that Israel was going to commit genocide, and I'm against it. And I saw it 20 years ago, where I had flipped around with these things, and had basically for a period of time became a genocidal racist myself, where just not all human life is valuable, or they deserved it, they're being punished. And then at some point in my early 20s, I just flipped. This is wrong. I'm against it. I had the backing of then anti-Zionist Jewish community and rabbis. And so I've been largely just sticking with that opinion. I've had that opinion from the first time we talked till today. But yeah, I'm not really sure that there's any benefit. I was just kind of forced to, at some point, just say something and stick with it. And so I've kind of just been weathering the results of doing that.
So I would tell you that what I'm doing is both seeking status and morally signaling. You claim that what's primarily driving you is allegiance to a set of moral values, and I am skeptical of that.
And the people who taught me them.
Right, but I'm skeptical of that because virtually none of the people who taught you that would want you to say these things publicly. So I think what's really driving you is that you remember the intoxication of being the favorite Jew of anti-Semites like Adam Green. This is an opportunity for you to gain status in that crowd.
Well, on a deeper level, I say I suffer from some sort of Messiah complex, and I feel like I'm understand Judaism better than even most rabbis, that I even have some sort of indoor, I could prove or demonstrate that I was connected to these, rabbis of rabbis that only speak Yiddish, and that I feel I have actually hidden secrets, and that I'm, kind of here, to share them at the risk of death. I know the punishment is death for sharing these secrets, but I'm going to share them anyways. And I mean, you could interpret it different ways, but from my own cycle or people I know similar, I'd say it's more a Messiah complex.
Yeah, that makes sense to me, because when you suffer as much status failure and pain, humiliation, and ostracism as both of us have suffered, the one most likely source of comfort that we tell ourselves is, well, at least I see through the bullshit. And that's frequently been a source of comfort for me. And another way of saying Messiah complex is to say, well, at least I see through the nonsense. I see things more clearly than people who have more status than me.
Well, and it's even worse than that, any cultic type movement where it's an acceptance where, no, it is us against the world. The Shimon Bar Yochai and his son, he says it's literally just us. Everybody else is on the side of evil. And, basically all cults need that, especially Orthodox and the more rejection of society. And, just thinking back when I was on the inside, just everybody was an anti-Semite, even your mailman, even your own workers, everybody was it was just a pure line. You didn't speak English, it was, just obviously it's us against the world. Obviously everybody wants to kill us. And the whole proof that we're right is that everybody's against us. And so, for decades, I probably sought that out personally, for whatever we've discussed. I had a troubled childhood and joining these extremist Hasidic Jews. But at some point, now I'm a renegade Hasidic Jew, but I'm not connected to a larger movement. And I'm, basing my credibility of, kind of being a scholar and truth teller. I actually dedicated my life to figuring out these mysteries. And actually, I I had some visions when I was doing it earlier, but I think it's just kind of making the best with my situation where it's like, well, what can I do with all this information? And I'm not really going to be a teacher of Jews. I'm not valuable to the Jewish community. And I could be valuable to anti-Semites. I don't really want to be valuable to anti-Semites. So that's why I've largely disappeared. I think that, like, me as an influencer, I don't really have an identity that I really can't. I can't even put myself in a genre or character where I could, anything other than like the failure dissident Jew who largely failed at his mission.
So here are the times I've had some similar trajectories to what you just discussed. And I once had a good friend who punctured my pomposity. He said to me, I know you think you're a big hero for the things that you say online, but if you ever really did anything heroic, you'd be killed. And then I had a therapist who said something that really made me think. He said, what if you'll only heal? What if you'll only get well if you'll put down your guns? And he was referring my guns, meaning my blogging, my vlogging, my social media posts. So let's say someone you respected and someone who cared about you said to you, Dooovid, you'll only heal if you put down these verbal weapons. How would you think about that?
At this point, there really is no one close to me other than my parents are too old. And I could see, like, because I was, as a kid, I was bad for just having a bad mouth, an evil mouth in a different way than I am now. But I mean, someone has to like be reaching their arm out and say, like, for what? So, okay, like, I'm just a loser who failed at life and is accepting my failed status and fading into oblivion, or I'm gonna be loud. I'm not gonna fade out quietly, and therefore going to add more destructive behavior to hope that there's one spark of another reinvention. It's like that's not what I'm trying to do. That's largely why I've decreased from streaming, focused on education and local events. I mean, honestly, I did see University of Michigan, Uncensored America's coming to University of Michigan next week, and I could see a path that would actually work out good for me, and that would be like the leading Jewish voice for war crime trials against my fellow Jews. And like, I'm not sure. I mean, I could see, like, I really don't have anything to lose. I mean, someone could kill me or something, but like, and I think it'd be the ultimate validity to the arc of my 20 years as an anti-Zionist to look like these people knew better. I warned you. I told you they were going to commit genocide. Here they did it, and now there's got to be war crime trials. So I could possibly see I could see a demand for me in that case. Although I don't have any expertise in that, like, so I'm not going to be the one. So even that, it's just like, at best, it's kind of like, well, I was right. This guy that nobody liked was saying things that everyone thought was outrageous, happened to be right. But I'm not sure that's going to help me become an influencer or anything else. So, I'm not sure. I mean, you've always been in the limelight or news or in Hollywood, as where I've had rises of being a prominent person in different fields, but my fame was relatively short-lived, largely because of you. Even on SJJ, I was mentioning like it was. Almost all of the mega streams that I got connected to were directly through you. And it's like John Mersheimer says, like now it's reached the battlefield. So like what we were engaged in years ago, you were at the forefront of, you included me in it. It was big for a few years, but now it's reached the battlefield. And I don't really think pundits are all that valuable, influence or even all that valuable, because, like John Mersheimer says, at this point, it's going to be decided on the battlefield.
So how important is it to you to be validated and to be right as opposed to some other outcome?
I was talking to Church of Entropy about how much of our mediation of fellow happens through the computer. So I think at this point, you don't really need mediation. You don't need validation from other people. You just need them to like hit the button that you fulfilled your obligation, and then, you get paid. Or like I was saying, like task performance, like doctors don't need to be held in high social esteem They just need the person to give them a positive review. So I think the nature of how we interact with technology, unless you're part of like a Jewish group or Black group or minority where regularly that all of you people gather and there's some sort of pecking order that gets sorted out from how much you help the group on a regular, like the best that you could really do is get your digital validation and your payment. And then, maybe to find a small group or something like that. But I'm not sure how much you've analyzed the nature of the change in being mediated by the machine. You would think, like, what's a good doctor is someone who has a high rating on the internet or that is respected in some sort of community.
It'll depend, but for most people, what's happening offline is going to be more important than their Second Life rating online.
I mean, like my eBay, okay, like I got one bad review, but like, I have a 99.8% seller rating on eBay. My business, my customers, relatively like me, although it's completely impersonal. Versus like, okay, I don't have any friends. Like I've completely fallen out of almost anything besides chess coaching. But like, okay, in other ways, I'm being validated like as a successful businessman. In the few jobs that I do, I'm getting good reviews, and I'm making my salary or getting small increases as opposed to basically having no social validation at all.
So, what would be more important to you, being validated or being right? So many years ago, I profoundly shifted the stream away from telling people what they wanted to hear, talking about the things that people wanted to hear spoken about in the ways that they wanted to hear spoken about. And instead, I put a priority on what I believe to be true, even if that reduced my attention and viewership to 10% of what it was. So what's more important to you, to be validated or to say what is true?
Well, I mean, if you mean validated, like getting paid, that's why I was making, like, is getting paid a form of validation, or is that a different category?
Yes, that's one type of validation. Another is just people paying attention to you.
Yeah, I think I've always leaned in favor of just getting paid and then having my freedom. Like social validation, social status is a positive, but it also takes away from your freedom and your individuality. And if you could choose between social popularity and payment, I would lean more on the payment side, because then I could just quietly do as I please with the money, as opposed to, even if you do have high social status, there's not as much freedom as just, money. So maybe you've tiered the other direction where money wasn't as important to you as social validation. But I mean, in some way, I think it's easier to convert money into social validation than to convert social validation into money, although you could also convert social validation into money.
All right, so I chose to sacrifice money, audience, online validation, instead to put a higher priority on what I believe to be true, not for necessarily altruistic reasons, but because I wanted to have higher status with a tiny number of people for whom I had great respect, rather than a wide audience that I didn't respect. So we get to choose who we want validation from.
I mean, you mean, when I look at true, like, okay, I research and I'm curious. I want to find out the truth about, sociology and psychology, but more about material things, how technology works. I'm not sure if when you say truth, you're talking like small t, political or social truths, or you're talking intellectual truths. And I don't necessarily see the connection between social things and living a life for truth, and even say that might be the opposite. If you want to be more true, you have to resign from most social things.
No, so I don't mean truth in the sense of social suicide, in the sense that every society has some basic truth that you can't say out loud. But if I'm going to tackle an issue, I'm going to tackle it on the basis of I'm going to try to say as much truth as possible, and I don't care if everybody in the audience disagrees with me. So COVID's one example. Virtually all of my audience are COVID skeptics, and I hold by the conventional wisdom with regard to COVID. I don't believe that our elites are bad. I don't believe that the people are usually right. I believe that it's a mixture. So on issue after issue, I differ from much of my audience. I don't believe that Jews are nefarious. I believe that they're just a group with strengths and weaknesses like any other group. I don't believe that Israel is engaging in genocide, even though there's an enormous audience that wants to hear that. I think that Israel is reacting as any other group would in its situation. So there are all sorts of incentives online to say things that you can't hear in the mainstream media. That's why people listen to live streams. And I made a deliberate choice that I'm going to simply say what is true and let Kevin Michael Grace and other distant streamers, they can have all that audience, because I would prefer to go in a different direction.
Yeah, but you seem to be, you're saying like small t truths, like political truths or social truths, which are questionable whether they're truths at all. Like, as opposed, okay, I dedicate my life to the search for truth. I wouldn't call it social suicide, but that means renunciation and trying to answer the most difficult questions facing a man that are largely in science and technology and not social things. I also like psychology and sociology, but even that, like to say, okay, I like studying psychology, but what's the actual, I don't, like to say that there's a truth, like you're a bad person who portrays yourself to be a good person, or just, the basic hypocrisy where I kind of accept that all people are hypocrites. So when I was younger, like that was, I had a really bad mouth, and I was, somewhat like a child prodigy, and I had a big talent for finding people's hypocrisy and pointing it out in embarrassing ways in public. And I was just a little kid. But maybe you were like that also, or have a little pleasure in that.
Yes.
And you're saying still till today. And to me, it's just like, well, it's obvious everyone's a hypocrite. Like, is it really speaking truth to point out that a person portrays themselves to be better than they actually are, or certain aspects of their behavior contradict other aspects, even if they're a person in a position of power? So I don't really see why you think that's truth-telling.
Right. So tell me about your big T truths that you pursue while I preoccupy myself with these small T truths.
I mean, the biggest questions like consciousness, the origins of human behavior. So besides where like, okay, I'm an engineer and I have a lot of interest in just technology. I studied programming, accounting, databases, and how these things could make life better, or business, or various things. My interest is mostly consciousness, the origins of the human mind, and human behavior. So I would say I'm looking more for a general theory that could be useful in describing all behavior. I'm not particularly interested in individuals' behavior, as where Luke Ford is maybe the categorical opposite, where he's basically interested in individuals' behavior and only has minor interest in the categorical scientific understanding that could explain all people's behavior.
Okay, I'm going to move on soon, but was there a topic that you'd like to explore before we move on?
Did you have thought on that assessment of saying we're categorically the opposite?
I think it's delusional, because what you're talking about there is you want to operate in a realm where you can't be invalidated, and so that you can tell yourself that you're pursuing some big T truth and there's no way to invalidate it because it is so abstract and removed from reality. So I think that many of the topics that I tackle are as big T truth as anything that you were just discussing.
Well, I mean, you're putting it on kind of like a pejorative, and I say, well, I'm an INTP, 2 to 3% of the personality. That's just my personality type. And often people like me and you make good teams, because I'm not really interested in people. I'm interested in the bigger ideas, is where you're more interested relatively in people than the bigger ideas. And, therefore, life is small, short, and you can't do everything. And therefore, do your strength and interest and team up with people who complement you.
Oh, that's interesting. So do you accept the truth of the theory of evolution?
I mean, personally, I'm questioning on that. So that would be something that saying I would be educated. Like, my opinion doesn't matter. I'm not the judge of it, but I lean against it, and I have a bunch of reasons, for that are important. I say it's my personality type that I was always kind of a behind the scenes guy, and maybe you're the opposite, and you're thinking that those personality types of someone who's not really interested in people that much is more better for the behind-the-scenes guy in the face of the one who's actually interested in people, and we probably need more of that cooperation. Like, different people have different personality types, proclivities, and interests, and they need to complement each other instead of fighting each other.
Okay, Dooovid, good to catch up with you, man. I'll talk to you later.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Yep, bye-bye. Okay, let me play a little bit more here from John Podhoretz.
They're all very upset that Congress does not take a larger role in insisting on its prerogatives as the, as really the prime mover in American political life. But nonetheless, if Congress is going to be an irresponsible body, and nobody can trust that if you brought 4 people in to tell them what the hell was going on here last night, say you'd invited them to the White House last night, and they happened to be in Washington last night, you invited the heads of the intelligence committees of the House and the Senate and the minority leaders of those committees and of the armed services committees or whatever, and said, come into the White House. We are informing you that we are doing this. We need you to stay here until the mission is over.
Yeah, maybe Trump didn't follow the proper process. I don't know if I'm going to be able to sleep, man. Did he check all the boxes? Does the UN approve of this move? And I'm not endorsing this move. I don't have an opinion on whether or not it was a good idea and in America's interest or in Venezuela's interest for Trump to take out Maduro. But where I do have a strong opinion is that the elite consensus that Trump's an idiot deserves more pushback. So in early December, the Trump administration released a document, the National Security Strategy, which reportedly was largely written by Michael Anton, the author of the hyperbolic Flight 93 election essay from early 2016. And in light of Trump's actions in Venezuela, probably worth revisiting the National Security Strategy document. And the most radical departure in the document is that it says America has the right to intervene in the Western Hemisphere to ensure its own interests and to ensure stability. And cartels are a danger. And cartels are effectively terrorist operations. And the Trump administration feels completely at ease with taking them out. The National Security document moves away from an emphasis on supporting NATO. And the document lists domestic American culture as a security priority. And it identifies cultural subversion and hostile foreign influence as on par with terror attacks, right? So it wants to restore the American spiritual and cultural health, which I'm sure for many elites sounds like fascism. It also emphasizes complete economic decoupling from China in various strategic sectors, frames trade deficits not just as economic issues, but as national security vulnerabilities. I think these are all moves in the right direction. Remember when we first heard about Bill Cosby drugging and raping women? It just completely changed the way we thought about his track record of making jokes about drugging and raping women. And it changed the way we thought about lovable Dr. Huxtable in the hit Cosby TV show where he plays an OBGYN who works out of the privacy of his own home. And we found out that in his 1969 comedy album, It's True, he performs a long routine about his childhood quest to find Spanish fly to slip into women's drinks. So we completely revised our understanding of Bill Cosby's jokes. And now I think we have to completely revise our understanding of the national security statement that was released about a month ago.
That, A, they weren't there. B, they cannot be trusted now that everybody has a phone and everybody has you cannot trust that somebody is not going to leak. And Trump said that literally. He said Congress leaks. And you got to say that in total contravention of what the first Trump administration was like, this administration does not leak. The Trump administration, the first year in 2017, it was
I mean, the Hegseth situation notwithstanding.
Right. Okay. But that was inadvertent. But I mean, I'm talking about leaking for the purposes of, I got a fun piece of information. I just got to call Maggie Haberman and tell her right now because it's burning a hole in my tongue.
Or, I mean, in the first Trump administration, we saw leaks to undermine colleagues.
Right.
It was people or to undermine policy ends. So people who didn't.
So I put this idea into Gemini and it was skeptical. It says this is a common observation. and there's some truth to it, but there's also an enormous amount of backstabbing. So the resistance is gone, but court intrigue remains. You have a lot of loyalist on loyalist leaking. And you have a great deal of fear as a silencer. So the chaotic leaking of the first Trump administration seems to be a thing of the past.
Like each other would leak against each other, or people who oppose the policy ends of the administration would leak for that purpose. And we didn't see any of that here. And this is where I think Rubio's role is important, because he's a former senator and he understands what the concerns of his colleagues, not just Democratic colleagues, but we did see Republicans speak out and express concern. In particular, Mike Lee, the senator from Utah, said we should have been notified. And then he got back on and said, I've just spoken with Marco Rubio and everything that happened is okay. But I think Rubio is sensitive to those concerns and was able to obviously speak to them directly, to his former colleagues. You know, he has a good relationship with Republicans and Democrats on the Hill. He was confirmed by wide margins, et cetera.
I mean, look, obviously there's been leaking all year in relation to Ukraine. But those are leaks that are intended to deal with long-term policy questions and try to get things out or confuse the story or something like that. What I'm talking about is, the sort of undermining things, or what it's just people who are new to politics or new to the White House or new to something, who are just so excited to have the phone numbers of the lead reporters of the New York Times and the Washington Post and Politico and all that, and like could not keep their mouths shut. They couldn't bear, if they had something, not to tell people about it. And so this obviously there's a maturity here in the ability to keep. Trump pretty much says what he's going to do, just doesn't say when, or he kind of fudges about when. But he said we were going to take out the Iranian nuclear.
Yeah, it's hilarious. You can make a strong case that Donald Trump is the biggest prevaricator ever as an American president. And you can also make a strong case that he's the biggest truth teller. Maybe both can be true. So Halperin's got a column out in the Daily Mail. He says that American military force overseas has been a pivot. Instead of prolonged drips of force with open-ended commitments and complex counterinsurgency theories and ambiguous end goals, now we have the use of force that is minimalist, kinetic, be fast, get in, get out, announce victory. So despite Trump saying we're going to run Venezuela, if you look under the rhetoric, this appears to be not nation building, but a target for a specific police action. We've got Trump bypassing the quagmire fatigue. We have a doctrine of punitive strikes rather than occupation. This is all easier to sell to a war-weary American public. And Trump is so open about oil. Right? This is a return to a realist, a mercantilist foreign policy. We have open coordination with American energy companies. Right? No other president that would say this is about oil. And we've got an open warning shot to Beijing and Moscow, right? A client state of Russia and of China is no longer a client state of Russia and China. So Trump is enforcing status closure on Venezuela with regard to Russia and China. Trump is telling foreign powers that their patronage cannot protect local leaders from American reach. And right, we seem to be headed towards regime change in Cuba and the American takeover of Greenland. And I would expect American military force deployed against Mexican drug cartels. And whether you love it or hate it, whether you intellectually think it's terrible or the good thing, it's certainly entertaining. And Trump's not afraid to enjoy this, right? It shows low status if you're a commentator, if you're a member of the elite, that you're excited and enjoying what's going on. So you have to pretend to be above it all, right? Journalists love the gee whiz factor, right? They love special access. They love high-tech maps. They love B-roll of aircraft carriers. They love the TikTok of a special forces raid. They love the great TV of this stuff. But they despise the administration, and they don't want to be open and out about enjoying these raids. So you get these jarring pivots from, look at this incredible Delta Force capability, to this is a constitutional crisis. And it's so artificial, right? The media tone shifting instantly from admiration to condemnation. Right? The news loves a good Hollywood-style raid. They will start narrating the news like it's a thriller, but They see themselves as guardians of democracy. So they have to snap out of enjoying it. They have to snap out of narrating a thriller to deliver to us a lecture on international law. It's stilted. It's artificial. Right? Halperin is honest. This is about oil, oil, oil. Network News talks about euphemisms, stability, democracy, international law, human rights, restoring norms. So we have the spectacle of war, which sells to viewers, and then it is accompanied by this performance of theology and morality and lecturing us about universal moral principles, which they try to combine with the spectacle. Right? It's this secular sermonizing that has become the default voice of the mainstream media, and this piety grates. Right? The elite news journalists behave less like reporters gathering facts, and more like a priestly class officiating a liturgy, right? This guardian of democracy stance is annoying, right? They're not content with simply telling us what happened. They have to morally instruct us. They have to tell us how we should feel about what happened. And this piety is annoying, especially when they're narrating the context of a raw event, right? The piety pose is ultimately about power. They frame themselves as the guardians of democracy, and so they then appoint themselves as the arbiter of what is appropriate. And Trump has bypassed their approval. He acted unilaterally. He ignored international norms. He admitted he wants the oil. He says he doesn't need their moral permission slip, that it's worthless. And so the media's reaction is indignation. They're mad at the disrespect shown to their role of gatekeepers of democracy. And so they are scolding, and it's grating. Right? Piety is all about process, procedures, and norms. It's about the appearance of propriety. Right? A pious worldview doesn't like smash and grab events. They're too raw. They don't like anything that doesn't fit within the liturgy of international diplomacy and globalized moral norms, where you hold summits and you issue joint communiques and you follow the rules and you check all the boxes. So you have the news media retreating into these furrowed brows about legal authority. Right? They're trying to drag a real-world event back into an etherealized, abstract, buffered discussion of globalized moral and legal principles. Right? They're uncomfortable in the world of reality, the world of raw kinetic action, where their commentary feels unimportant. So they can't help providing this profound disconnect between their visceral excitement over the raid. They can't help but cover it with the dour, finger-wagging commentary that follows. It's artificial because the news treats the audience as morally fragile, who needed to be guided to the correct moral conclusion. Right? The news treats the viewer not as a citizen to be informed, but as a congregant to be catechized. So the stilted nature of the news media with regard to this raid is the friction between the reality of the footage, which says American power is awesome and overwhelming, and the commentary says this is problematic. Where did the news media get this idea that it was their role to be secular priests and to guard democracy? It's so out of kilter with reality. Nobody likes a group that proclaims themselves to be holier than thou.
Clear program. And we did. We were just like, he's doing what he always does, which is he says he's going to, give a plan in 2 weeks and he doesn't do it. But he did it. He said Maduro was going to be out of there one way or the other. So he actually doesn't hide his intentions.
Yeah.
But the operations, they actually do manage to achieve, at least when things are deadly serious, like you're taking out a nuclear program or you're going to arrest the sitting, dictator of a foreign country. You got to do that with as much sophistication and security as possible, and they have met that challenge twice now in very high-level ways. Right? The only thing anyone ever knows now is whether or not there's a spike in the pizza ordering at the Pentagon, which is one of these funny things that now pops up on Twitter. Oh, my God, somebody's calling for pizzas at 11 o'clock at night at the Pentagon all over Arlington. That must mean that something is happening. But that's not a leak, obviously. That's just sort of like a funny little piece of business.
But now the difficult work begins of figuring out who's actually going to run the country, because that to me was a little alarming in the press conference after Trump, took a sort of bow about how well operationally they pulled this off. Sort of shrugging and saying, well, me, the guy standing behind me, we'll all just figure it out. Now, that's actually where I think Congress is going to have to start being more aggressive. People should ask questions. He sort of made a swipe at Mikado, the exiled Nobel Prize-winning opposition leader, who has come out already and endorsed the current opposition person in Venezuela, whose name is escaping me right now, as someone who should be considered a leader. The the vice president is still calling herself an interim president and still supporting the now arrested leader. So there's a lot of confusion about who's actually going to pick up the pieces here. And that's where I think Donald Trump has tended to lose focus and become distracted. So I am grateful that Rubio seems to be taking the lead on this one and seems to have some ideas along that score and has talked to reporters already about some of this. But that's the big challenge now.
Yeah, and there's a basic information gap about what Donald Trump means when he says the U.S. is going to run Venezuela. You know, you run a corporation, and he no doubt has commercial ambitions, American, related commercial ambitions to have to do with energy extraction involved in this. But we have no idea what run Venezuela, the Americans are going to run Venezuela for now. Boots on the ground.
So tawdry that Donald Trump is talking about national interests. So tawdry to talk about money. My God. One of the things that I loved about converting to Judaism is the increased ease that Jews have with talking about the natural passions, including passions for money, for status, for love, for sex, for honor. Right? These are all natural passions. You simply, to be a good and pro-social person, you need to channel your natural passions. Now, this pious guardian of democracy role by the mainstream media, it grates because it's not a reporter function. It's not a journalistic function. It's a political function. It's a priestly function. It's a religious, moral, theological function. Right? Traditionally, the news media's role would be the watchdog, the fourth estate. Right? The watchdog is supposed to bark at everyone in power. Right? It's supposed to be skeptical and cynical and negative and to assume that everyone is lying. But this guardian of democracy pose means I'm a protagonist. A guardian has a side. If you're guarding something, you're fighting for it, which means you identify enemies and you defeat them. And this shift by the elite news media to guardianship of democracy is disconnected from reality. Number one, it's a mechanism of status closure, right? The media is the guardian of democracy. And so the elite draw a sharp circle around what is legitimate discourse. They want to narrow the Overton window and make it as complex, ethereal, abstract, and buffered as possible so ordinary people cannot participate. And this is all in the name of democracy. Right? Those who agree with the media's buffered, globalized, international law, human rights, moralistic, cultural and moral consensus, they are the people who are pro-democracy. Right? Anyone who challenges the narrative, whether it's Trump or Jacob Savage or the alt media, not just wrong, they're bad. They're a threat to democracy. So the media is trying to monopolize the market on truth, moral truth, factual truth. They're not just reporting the news. They are defining the boundaries of what is moral reality, right? Reality is reality, whether or not it's moral or not. And when the news media sermonizes, when they preach at us, right, they're trying to reinforce their own status as the high priests of morality, and it bugs me. And when they talk about democracy, it's a code word. When they say we're guarding democracy, right, it means that they are guarding a specific technocratic consensus of their fellow elites. Right? Real democracy is messy, chaotic, often populist, results in things that the elite hate, such as the election of Donald Trump or Brexit or a smash and grab raid in Venezuela. So if the news media was really about respecting democracy, they respect that the American public often supports populist, unwise, brash choices. But whenever the public supports something that the elite dislike and the media claims that democracy is in peril. Right? When you have majoritarian instincts rising up, that's a threat to democracy. Right? By democracy, they really mean the correct outcome or rule by experts who are supposedly disinterested. Right? You cannot be a neutral observer and a guardian at the same time. Right? A referee cannot also be a player. Once the media decides it's their job to save the country from Donald Trump or from misinformation or from populism, they cease to be reporters. They become combatants. Our elite media have chosen to leave their role as reporters and to become fighters. So this stilted tone is the sound of a combatant pretending to still be the referee. They editorialize in the guise of reporting, which creates this uncanny, artificial, off-putting vibe. And it's this bogus piety that drives these lost generation essays by people like Jacob Savage, people who want to grapple with the world as it is, brutal, transactional, complex, right? Have no home in an elite media landscape that demands moral purity. Right? The guardians cling to these simple moral fables. Reality is often a tragedy or a farce. Media doesn't want to engage with the dark, cynical humor of reality, the giddy Trump on Fox and Friends, and it makes them seem dour, humorless, out of touch. Nobody likes people who claim to be holier than thou. So you have a populist revolt against elites. People don't like a moral narcissist when a group claims to be holier than thou while living in the same messy, compromised world as the rest of us. It triggers a deep, instinctive resentment. It feels like a power play disguised as virtue. And it is toxic for their credibility.
He said he's not afraid of boots on the ground. But what does that mean? How are courts going to run? Or, you know, given that this is still a decapitated Maduro regime, what's the U.S. relationship with the Maduro underlings who are now in charge? It's so many questions.
Yeah, well, I think it leaves. That was the.
People prefer an honest sinner to some bogus priest, obviously out of touch with reality. People have more trust on Donald Trump, who's transactional and rough and crude, more than the elite media who claim to be objective and noble. Right? Trump goes on TV and he rejoices in saying, I took the guy out. We're keeping the oil. It's good for us. And it's brutal and it feels true and authentic. He isn't pretending to be a saint. He is admitting to being a shark. The media goes on TV and says, we're deeply concerned about international norms and the spirit of the U.S. Constitution. But the viewer knows that they are chasing ratings, they love the drama, and that they are partisan and power-seeking in their own way. People will forgive a shark for being a shark, but they will not forgive a shark who claims to be a priest. So piety is being wielded by our elites as a weapon of class, as a weapon of status closure. Right? It costs nothing for these pundits to moralize about due process for foreign policy. The average person, the world is a tough, practical place. They care about results, safety, prices, order, more than process and international norms. So the news media looks down their nose at this smash and grab operation, an operation that apparently worked. So they want to signal their class distance. They want to say, we're too refined for this. They want to transform political differences into a hierarchy of there are clean souls like us and there are dirty souls like MAGA. Right? They want to be clergy without God. They want to make claims to a holiness and a piety that doesn't bear much basis in reality. Right? So normally when you have a religion, it has these ways to be real and to be humble and to confess and to admit that one is flawed and a sinner. Right? So this guardian class has all the judgment that we associate with religious power, but none of the honesty and openness about being flawed. Right? They don't rejoice in saying, hey, we got this wrong. They just double down repeatedly on their moral superiority to you. And it's this lack of humility, this defiance of reality that makes them feel so stilted and arrogant and holier than thou and not exactly inspiring. And they provoke a barbarian response. When the gatekeepers become insufferably pious, the natural counter-reaction is to say, F you. If the news media wants to portray themselves as secular priests, then people start looking for Vikings, right? Writers, podcasters, politicians who are deliberately rude, crude, raw, impious, just to prove that they are not part of this fake class, right? Donald Trump's giddy demeanor at this raid is the ultimate middle finger to media piety. He refuses to be solemn. He's enjoying this. For the pious, having fun while breaking the rules, that's the ultimate sin.
Open question from the press conference, and we should get to some of there were some amazing moments, especially when he said there's a $50 million bounty on his head, and then he turned to Rubio and said, don't let anybody claim it. We get to claim it. Like, nobody gets to claim the $50 million bounty. But the open question from the press conference was, what exactly did he mean by we're going to run Venezuela? But I do think, we'll have a lot of time to discuss that in the coming days.
And so I think that's an important point, which is, we're speaking, hours after the thing happened. Things are very confused. The vice president, who is now the president, says that she demanded the return of Maduro, who was, illegitimately kidnapped, after Trump said that Rubio had talked to her and that she had said, "I'll do whatever you need." So we don't know what the hell is going on, and that'll clarify itself. Some of that will clarify itself in the next 24 to 48 hours.
Yeah, I mean, the big question seemed to me is, are they going to be okay with Maduro's underlings remaining in place, or are they going to try to more thoroughly clean this out? And Trump did, in the press conference, seem to me to understand exactly the problem, where he said something to the effect of, we don't want to be involved with having somebody else get in and having the exact same situation. If it's just his number two, that's not much of a change, is what he said. And yet he didn't say, so this is our plan, like we're not going to allow that. But he suggested he understands the problem without having an explicit plan to combat it. So I think he does get that. But I also think it's worth.
So the alt media gets a taste of success, develops an audience, and they also start trying to proclaim themselves holier than thou, right? So these people are headed for a fall as well. Right, you storm the castle and then proclaim you're holier than thou, you're going to be humbled. So the mainstream media has the piety of the cathedral, right? And the alternative media often suffers from the piety of the purge. And they can be just as rigid, just as humorless, just as obsessed with policing who's based and who's a cuck and who's a sellout. So people in alt media just as vulnerable to getting detached from reality. There's the trap of audience capture, where you start out as a free thinker saying unpopular things, then you attract an audience that loves you for it, and then your audience demands a specific kind of red meat. And if you deviate, right, then your audience revolts. So often people in alt media become a caricature of themselves, cannot build an identity solely on being anti-something without becoming a mirror image of your enemy. So if the mainstream media is the church of woke, then the alt media often tries to become the church of based. But a church is still a church. Requires dogmas, excommunications, and saints. Right? There are all these distant figures who are now terrified of stepping out of line with their tribe's orthodoxy, and they have simply recreated the exact stifling atmosphere of the newsrooms that they claim to hate. We've got grifting as the new piety. So for the mainstream media, the currency is prestige and access. In the alt media, the currency is attention and monetization. And we have people gaining power, influence, and proximity to the White House who are forming their own elite circles, closing ranks, protecting their own holy generals and bishops, start excusing the failure of their own team, ruthlessly attacking the enemy, and they start trying to enact their own forms of state disclosure as they go to war with reality. So you're supposed to be a reluctant warrior, and Trump's enjoyment of this raid is infuriating to our elites, right? The standard script for a modern president is the reluctant warrior. He's supposed to say, I hate war. This is a last resort. My heart is heavy, right? Trump flips the script. He says, our military is great. It's huge. This mission was perfect. Winning feels great. So he enjoys the victory, and he refuses to pay the tax of performative guilt. So to an elite class that believes the currency of guilt is the currency of virtue, this looks like sociopathy. Right. For Trump and his supporters, this looks like honesty. Trump's joy exposes media solemnity as a pose. Right. He smiles, and so he makes the elites and their claims of sleepless nights look theatrical and like overacting. Right. Trump's joy suggests that maybe governing isn't the mystical, crushing burden that only a select priest can bear. It suggests that maybe it's just a job and a satisfying one. So Trump's demystification of the presidency is a direct threat to this elite status. And it's vulgar, right? Elites are trained to view winning as something you should be humble about. You're supposed to speak in the passive voice. Mistakes were made, actions were taken. Right? Trump treats this military raid like a real estate deal or a wrestling match. We won, they lost. Look at the scoreboard. Right? This raw, visceral, competitive joy is low class. It smells of the gladiator arena rather than the faculty lounge. Right? It reminds them at its core, power is violent and coercive. no matter how many Latin phrases you try to wrap up the power in.
We're talking about, like, I recall I was remembering our conversation about the national security strategy and my own comment that, like, these things don't really usually matter that much. They're just words on paper. And I went back to read it today and thought, like, geez, I was so wrong, because the national security strategy that came down in November 2025 has explicitly a mention of a Trump corollary that reads, the United States will reject outside powers' efforts to displace the United States in the Western Hemisphere and defend regional sovereignty against foreign interference. And it explicitly mentioned, we seek the cooperation of other powers in this hemisphere to combat narco traffickers and so on. And I think this is going to have massive implications, not just for Venezuela, but also for Cuba and for Iran.
And Colombia.
And Colombia.
And Colombia. He said that the president of Colombia has to, quote, watch his ass, because he said the president of Colombia is making cocaine and sending it to the United States. And he's just seen what we did to somebody we claim has been distributing illegal drugs in the United States. And so that has teeth. That has a lot of teeth. And all of a sudden, he now has actual action to back up the hollow through what has always sounded like hollow threats. You better not do it, or we're going to be blah 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 blah. Well, it's like, that was fun. Let's do it again. We'll do it in Bogota. Fine.
So does this tweet to the protesters in Iran that we're going to do everything we can to support them. Well, and by the way, it does appear that American military forces engaged in some kind of a firefight with Maduro's Cuban security. So there's already been some engagement with Cuba here as well.
Right. Okay. I think trying to figure out where we're going with this is very big, but the larger thing that is of importance to us institutionally is that MAGA is dead. MAGA foreign policy is dead. It's officially dead.
Oh, I don't think that's the right way to put it.
I disagree too.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay. No, but not MAGA. MAGA is not the right way to put it.
Well, the punditocracy that tends to have.
So does MAGA get to define what's MAGA, or does Donald Trump get to define what's MAGA? Does God get to define what's right and wrong, or does this eternal category of right and wrong, does that then get to define what God does?
Have most of its viewership and audience on YouTube. The Tucker Carlson, the very online MAGA foreign policy folks who have very little foreign policy knowledge. Yes. But look, this strategically.
So prior to this, Donald Trump coming along and getting elected president of the United States, there was like one dominant perspective on how to view foreign policy, and it was, don't be like Munich in 1938 and say peace in our time. You have to tackle evil. And then after the disaster of the Afghan and Iraq invasions, then the one dominant frame for understanding foreign policy and war was that any intervention is going to become a quagmire. And perhaps if Donald Trump pulls off these successful smash and grab raids, maybe people will more widely recognize that there's not just one framework to decide whether or not a form of foreign policy intervention is correct.
Long term, I went back and looked at that security strategy too, Eliana. Great minds today. And what worried me a little bit more long term, again, Donald Trump, not a long term thinker, is that everyone's going to, I think, in the immediate aftermath of this, say the short term message to Iran, to Russia, to China was, look, we say what we are going to do, and then we do it. And there was a Chinese delegation in Venezuela just a few days earlier talking to Maduro. So that was obviously also important. Obviously, this.
So the smarter someone is, the more likely they are to enjoy spending time in an abstract world. The more time you spend in an abstract world, the more likely you are to get disconnected from reality, which is why often very smart people tend to get disconnected from reality. And so you need to be able to harness your smartest people, your best and your brightest, to engage in choices that further your groups, your tribes, your nation's interest. And so in Israel, right, the intellectual elite is overwhelmingly Ashkenazi and quite anti-Netanyahu, and for Israel to pull off its successful seven-front war, they had to be able to harness the virtues and abilities of this high IQ elite that hates Netanyahu. And similarly in the United States, right, the more intelligent the person, the less likely they are to support Donald Trump. So America has some very smart people who tend to be anti-Trump and anti-nationalist, and now they see Donald Trump having fun with their toys. Military, intelligence agencies, the Situation Room, right? These are the sacred institutions of the establishment. They see themselves as the custodians of these tools. Now they have to put out with seeing Donald Trump play with their toys and to enjoy playing with their toys, right? It's like watching a teenager joyriding a classic Ferrari. They hate that he doesn't respect their toys, the machinery. He's not sufficiently somber while using it. So the elites are trying to maintain the atmosphere of a funeral. Donald Trump is throwing a victory parade, and it drives them crazy.
Sends a message to Iran. It sends a message to Russia. Russia, that great ally, sent a very firm letter, which I thought was hilarious, decrying this. But long term, if we care about the Western Hemisphere, where does that leave Europe? And there was another story over the last few weeks about the MAGA foreign policy, of which Vance is the likely future, dealing with Ukraine, dealing with Europe, how we will exercise our influence outside of our own hemisphere. And that is where China is super important here. And I'm not sure that this is a strong enough message to send to China if the long-term effect is we play in our backyard and you play in yours, and that's how the world should work.
Okay,
that isn't how the world works.
Okay, I got to disagree with you on this, because the first thing that he did in major foreign policy terms was take out the Iranian nuclear program. This is the second thing. So he's actually acted way, way far away from our shores and not in our hemisphere. The Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, which is clearly very important to him, and I think means that we should...
the Donroe Doctrine.
The Donroe Doctrine.
Terrible. Let's not use that.
Means that Greenland is back on the agenda. Everybody thought the whole Greenland thing was hilarious.
So Halperin's out a few days ago with a column, will 2026 break the left? Now, obviously it won't, because we have these instincts that get called left and right, but they are instincts that are evolved ways of responding to reality that have worked over centuries. So neither perspective is going to disappear, but Halperin's got a good challenge here. He says, what would it take for the American left and for anti-Trump conservatives who have turned their exile into a brand to admit that Donald Trump may have delivered something real on two important tests, peace and prosperity? Right? If Trump's opponents cannot acknowledge his success, right, they are at war with reality. Now, it's not set in stone that Trump is some kind of big success, but if Trump provides peace and prosperity, then at a certain point you have to give him credit. So Trump is setting a rhetorical trap for the left and for anti-Trump conservatives. Right? If inflation stays down, if the economy keeps humming, if there are no new wars, you would think that objective reality will force him to concede. And if his critics just keep attacking him in a rabid fashion, despite these realities of peace and prosperity, then it shows that they care more about hating than about the reality of American success. Right? They have moved from loyal opposition to automatic rejection. So the left and right currently are keeping score on different boards. So Mark Halperin focuses on peace and prosperity. Trump's critics focus on international norms, civil rights, democratic processes, and rhetoric. So even if 2026 brings peace and prosperity, Trump's critics won't view this as a success because they see these gains coming at the cost of judicial independence, international norms, social cohesion, minority rights. So Halperin would call this blindness. Trump's critics would call it prioritizing values over GDP. So people on the left eventually gave Ronald Reagan credit, and Republicans eventually gave Bill Clinton credit. Right now, this feedback loop is broken. So Halperin says we're entering an era of zero-sum reality. 2026 is a good year for America. It's a bad year for Trump's critics because it destroys their central thesis. So will Trump's critics cling to their narrative in the face of peace and prosperity? Or, if 2026 is a disaster for America, will Trump's supporters cling to their pro-Trump narrative against reality?
It's not hilarious. If I were Denmark, I would start figuring out how to price Greenland and sell it because he's going to take it. I don't see why not. He wants it, and he's going to take it based on that doctrine. But put that to one side. The person in the world who is the most frightened person right now is the Ayatollah Khamenei, because he is blind, he is powerless, he does not have anti-aircraft weaponry, he does not have any defensive or much offensive military technology that we are aware of that was not largely destroyed. He does not have a second strike capability. There is a gigantic revolt going on inside Iran right now. Israel has astonishing intelligence it can share with us about what is going on inside Iran. Who's to say that you are Khamenei and you are not now worried that he will drop into your compound and arrest you too? You are considered an international global terrorist according to the American law. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard has been designated as such. He is the head of the Iranian Guard Corps. I can't remember, the IGRC. He is very much in potential gun sights. And that would obviously be astonishing. What we now know is that they are running sophisticated long-term planning. That's what Kane told us. They spent months planning this mission. Months. 150 aircraft from all over the place. Different helicopters, planes.
And the chat says, as Luke talked about how Israel has become the enemy of both left and right in the United States, it seems to me that attacking the First and Second Amendments is low IQ. I would agree that attacking the First and Second Amendment is a poor strategy for success. I'm not sure that Israel has become the enemy. I would say that Israel has shifted away from its sacred status. You couldn't criticize Israel. For example, for many decades, every pundit employed by the mainstream media was pro-Israel, right? I can't think of any high-status news pundit who was anti-Israel or pro-Palestine. But I am so biased with regard to the Jewish state of Israel that I'm not sure how much wise commentary I can give you. So what is the Trump doctrine? So look at it in action. The Iranian regime of the mullahs is more vulnerable now than it's ever been, and that's in part because of Donald Trump. The United States now demands preeminence in the Western Hemisphere. The United States says it will prevent foreign adversaries, specifically China and Russia, from establishing any military or strategic economic hold in the Americas. America will use aggressive measures to secure supply chains, control migration flows, and combat transnational criminal organizations such as drug cartels as direct threats to American sovereignty. America will act brutally in its own interests. It will not view international relations as primarily a community of nations bound by shared values, but rather it's a competitive marketplace of sovereign states. Alliances like NATO will be viewed through a balance sheet. Allies will be expected to pay their fair share in return for U.S. protection. The American commitment to other nations is increasingly conditional on burden sharing rather than just being a gift. Economic security is now treated as seriously as national security. We have a doctrine now that favors bilateral trade deals where the U.S. can leverage its economic weight rather than multilateral agreements like the Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership that diluted U.S. leverage. We now have America using tariffs aggressively as a tool of diplomatic coercion. We have a doctrine rejecting forever wars and rejecting nation building, and much more ready to use smash and grab operations, that military forces will be reserved for direct threats to American interests, not for humanitarian intervention or for regime change. China is the primary strategic competitor. Europe needs to start relying on itself. In the Middle East, the U.S. is supporting Israel and withdrawing largely its forces, or at least that's the goal. So we've got the Trump doctrine breaking the mold of traditional bipartisan foreign policy to be much more nationalist. And according to Gemini, here are the people who best articulate and explain the Trump doctrine. Walter Russell Mead, the historian, the strategist Elbridge Colby, the cultural critic Christopher Caldwell, the economic architect Robert Lighthizer, and, my God, the Cold War realist Neil Ferguson, and the restrainer Sumantra Mitra.
7 different kinds of planes, different elements of the U.S. military, Air Force, Marines, Army, all of that. So who's to say they've not been doing similar gaming with Iran and what to do about the regime there? I mean, it's an obvious second strike thing for him to do, having blinded Iran and having weakened Iran to
and
maybe take the final steps. I don't know, but I don't think you can stand here and say that my saying that at some point in the next 2 months he might go in and try to decapitate the Iranian regime is like a crazy person talking.
Yeah, I mean, you can certainly no one can credibly say that Trump makes threats that he doesn't back up. We've seen it now twice, very spectacular ways. And he's given 2 casus belli regarding Iran now, currently. One is, well, really 3. One is if they are building up intercontinental ballistic missiles, period, because if they can build up enough that to overwhelm Israeli air defenses, it would be an enormous problem. Not as an enormous problem as an Iranian nuke, but a really enormous problem. 2, if they are working on reconstituting their nuclear program elsewhere. And 3, and this is a more surprising one, he said if the Iranian Basij and other internal repression forces fire on the Iranian protesters, as they're likely to do, he said something like that in his Truth Social post, the U.S. is going to be there to defend them, to stop that. That's pretty extraordinary. And he's also simultaneously threatening, essentially, to knock the hell out of Hamas if they don't actually disarm the easy way.
Right.
One thing I thought was really revealing from the press conference was that Trump put this strike or the seizure of Maduro, however you want to characterize it, the operation, in line. He's with 3 other operations that.
So, the interests of different states will always differ. Israel's interest is not ever going to be identical with the interest of any other nation. So, at times, America and Israel have interests in common, and at other times, America and Israel will have competing or conflicting interests. And I would hope that the United States of America puts American interests first. I would hope that the Jewish state of Israel puts Israel's interests first. I would expect that Japan would put Japan's interests first. So I'm particularly curious, will Iran's Mullah regime survive, right? The survival of this regime is more precarious than ever, right? We've got these widespread protests. They can't even provide water for their capital city. They've got structural economic failure, not cyclical. Their whole axis of resistance has fallen apart. And I think most likely shift will be from a theocracy to a military junta. Probably most likely to see Iran ruled by its Revolutionary Guard Corps. But never seen Iran this vulnerable as we see it right now.
He is overseen. And I think it gives a window into how he views military operations and how he views foreign policy. He compared this operation to the assassination of Soleimani, the assassination of al-Baghdadi, and the strikes on Iran, Operation Midnight Hammer. And those were essentially all things where he came and announced them. They were amazing feats that came and they were announced to the American public after they were done. But they're not limited to the Western Hemisphere. They're not, Trump. They're not geographic.
So what will be the repercussions for Cuba? what it would be the repercussions for Mexico, for China, for Russia, for Iran. Right? Cuba is more vulnerable now than it's ever been in the last 50 years. Right? For Beijing, this is a humiliation. This is a massive financial write-down. It exposed the limits of Chinese power projection in the American backyard. China lent Venezuela tens of billions of dollars. China has been trying to build a network of influence in Latin America. Right? China's been humiliated. Russia has lost its most significant forward operating base in the Western Hemisphere. Its military prestige has taken a hit. U.S. airstrikes penetrated Venezuelan airspace with ease. Mexico is now in a bind. It's got its ideological principles and its economic reality. Mexico has condemned the attack as a violation of sovereignty, which risks antagonizing Donald Trump, which may then retaliate with trade tariffs or border closures or going directly to war with Mexico's drug cartels. So Cuba is probably the most vulnerable. China has lost tens of billions of dollars. Russia has lost its primary foothold in the Western Hemisphere. And Mexico is stretched and stressed.
Graphically limited, and they do show John, as you said, that he's willing to go around the world doing these sorts of things. And the other thing is, with regard to the Trump corollary, I mean, this is related to Venezuela, is related to Iran. It was serving as a foothold for Russia, China, Iran, Hezbollah, which is Iran, in the Western Hemisphere. So I do think that they are directly related. And if you go read the indictment of Maduro, that indictment from 2020 makes very clear that the narco trafficking wasn't just an enrichment scheme for Maduro, but at least the government argued, and Bill Barr, who was overseeing the DOJ at the time, made a compelling argument that the narco trafficking was a bid to wage war on the United States and to flood the country with drugs and kill its citizens. And that was the explicit strategy of this cartel de los Solis.
Okay, also.
So there was a gem in Mark Halperin's latest column. So he says, national reporters ping-pong between policy detail and political intrigue. And lurking underneath is the unmistakable tension. Journalists know that this Somali fraud case, so this isn't his Halperin's latest column. This is his column a week or two ago. So journalists know that the Somali Minnesota fraud case is a huge story, but journalists do not want to amplify it because that could benefit Donald Trump. So the elite news media frequently practice status closure by closing ranks to protect preferred narratives and to exclude information that validates their political adversaries. And I asked Gemini, okay, give me the top 10 stories of the past decade that the news minimized, suppressed, or slow-walked because amplifying these stories risked politically benefiting Donald Trump. Right? We have this fear where reporting the truth becomes a political act if it benefits the wrong faction. So, number one, the Hunter Biden laptop story from October 2020. Have a laptop abandoned by the son of the Democratic nominee. Contains abundant evidence of influence peddling and drug use. And you have all these intelligence operatives saying, oh, there's all the hallmarks of Russian disinformation without providing any evidence. And the major tech platforms have banned mention and promotion of the story. Right? So the elite and the news media wanted to tell us that the adult's going to be back in charge with the Biden administration. And it didn't want to allow any validation of Trump's credible accusations of Biden family corruption. Second story that was suppressed by the news media was the Wuhan lab leak theory. Third story, Biden's obvious cognitive decline that started showing up in 2017 and just became more visible each year. Media didn't want to report on the Democratic National Committee's funding of the Steele dossier, which was a key document sparking Russiagate. News media didn't want to report on the violent reality of the mostly peaceful riots in the summer of George Floyd, summer of 2020. News media tried to reduce reporting on the border crisis under Joe Biden and the record-breaking numbers of illegal crossings and the logistical collapse of all sorts of border towns under the Biden administration. News media tried to play down the transitory inflation of the first couple of years of the Biden term. News media tried to play down the major spikes in crime in America's major cities under Joe Biden, well, starting in 2020 in the summer of George Floyd. Media has tried to play down the Minnesota Feeding Our Future scandal with Somali fraud rings. And the media wanted to play down the Afghan withdrawal debacle for fear that it would benefit Donald Trump.
So very important was the effort that Trump made to connect what happened here with domestic crime and law enforcement. So, which is striking because, of course, the justification.
And chat says YouTube censorship algorithm deletes criticisms of Jews in the chat comments. I think it's going to delete criticisms of any group except maybe white Christian men.
The reason that we would be doing this illegal narco trafficking is that drugs are flooding the United States and killing Americans. And he then said, look what we've done in D.C. We went into D.C. There is no crime in D.C. anymore. That may or may not be true. No more. There have been almost no murders. This is what he cited. He talked about L.A. He talked about various things that he has done to say there are reasons that every American domestically should think that the Venezuela mission is a direct effort to help the United States deal with the flood of drugs coming from outside our borders. Generally speaking, the intelligentsia, and I think properly, rightly, says, the problem with drugs is that people want to use them. And so we have a problem inside. It's not an outside problem. We've been spending 50 years on a war on drugs trying to, destroy poppy fields in Afghanistan and to raise the cost of this and do that. But the problem is the American hunger, the limitless American hunger for illegal narcotics. And he's saying, I want to stop the flow and raise the price and make people who are doing this stop doing it. So I'm going to try that. That has not been a centerpiece of our war on drugs for more than 30 years. And we'll see what happens with it. But it is an effort.
So do you notice the emotional temperature behind a lot of major news stories and how the elite news media really does not want to cover this Minnesota Somali fraud scandal? Why? Because it helps Trump. And Mark Halperin writes, even liberal operatives admit privately that if one were designing a scandal tailor-made for right-wing outrage, the end result would look like this one. Because the major role in the scandal played by the Somali American community and the Democratic Party that has enabled this fraud. Right, so we have this brutal high-velocity dissection here by Halperin of what happens when a high-trust bureaucratic culture collides with industrial-scale levels of fraud. Right, we have here a collapse of the administrative state's legitimacy. We've got a fraud that is metastasized to a potential $9 billion scale. And it is a textbook case of bureaucratic state disclosure. Certain groups are allowed to join this feeding trough, and other groups don't get to join. So if you show any skepticism of this program, it's a moral failure. You're showing racism. So auditors and whistleblowers have been excluded from the decision-making process until now. So this ideological rigidity on the part of the Democrats was used to close ranks, operate with state disclosure, and to deny the reality of billions of dollars of fraud. So billions of dollars of fraud was not just missed, it was structurally invisible because seeing this reality would require the bureaucracy and the elite media and the Democrats to violate their own internal status codes. Right? You have a legacy system, the Minnesota state government, rooted in Scandinavian-style high-trust assumptions getting dismantled by grifters, middlemen, and opportunists. So we have a Minnesota government that used to be operated along the lines of implicit norms of honor, shame, civic duty, to one that is now governed by explicit fraud and exploitation. We have grifters realizing that the state's oversight mechanisms are vestigial, they're out of date, and they acted accordingly, and the state was unable to react until forced to by Washington and people in the conservative news media. Now, Trump has frozen federal funding using the nuclear option for certain funding that bypasses the media narrative. And Governor Tim Walz of Minnesota is trapped using process language of a mid-century administrator, while Trump and the modern media cycle are using the language of war, corruption, chaos. So we have an asymmetrical conflict. And Halperin points out the obsolescence of the elite news media because you have a video investigation by YouTuber Nick Shirley that's probably done more to ignite this wildfire than traditional journalism. And it just shows the institutional rot and the declining prestige and power of the mainstream media. The elite journalists feared amplifying their stories because it could benefit Trump, right? They operated with state disclosure. The media restricted information flow to try to protect a particular political outcome, which then destroys their own credibility and fuels the rise of alternative media. And this video by Nick Shirley was just all over the place, man. Just
hello, we'd like to ask
successful.
where the money's going. What do you guys think about the fraud?
This kind of the maddening thing is you have daycare, so you have adult daycare, and then you have child care, and then you have health care. And a lot of these same names keep coming up on all of these different types of businesses. And then, of course, we have the transportation, and a lot of those same names appear, a lot of the same addresses. There's one building that has 14 Somali healthcare companies at the same address. There's another building in St. Paul that has 22 Somali healthcare businesses at the same address.
And the government knows about this?
The government knows. They're writing the checks. Yeah, the Democrats over there just writing the checks. What has happened is that the Somali community is a very closed community. They will not speak to anyone outside the community and talk about what's going on within the community. They vote as a block. And so when you're a politician, you're saying, look, I've got 100,000 people in Minnesota that if I do something for the community, they're going to vote for me.
Does that have the ring of truth? Yes, it does. Now, was this a definitive, formidable proving of the allegations? No, right? This was something that was much more suggestive than definitive.
To bring the American people into the raid on Venezuela and say, I'm doing this for you, right? It could have said about Iran. It was not entirely, I mean, it's of course true that we don't want nuclear proliferation. Iran's a bad actor. It hurts a lot of people and does terrorism, and it's terrible, and it deserved to have its nuclear program eliminated. But connecting that to the ordinary day-to-day life of somebody in Oklahoma is not really quite there. This, he is trying to say, is about you. I'm doing this the same way I'm trying to deal with crime on the streets in cities that have gone crazy with crime and with bad mayors.
I think he's alluding to the oil in the same way. In the same way, like one of his long-standing criticisms of the war in Iraq was that we didn't take enough from the country.
Oil. Yeah, we didn't take the oil. Right.
Yeah. To his thinking, the U.S. should directly benefit, should take the spoils, of a victorious operation. But there's a very real point here, which is that Venezuela really is a playground for all sorts of larger, serious enemies of the United States, and that allows them to get in proximity to being able to cross the border, which I'm sure many of them have. When you talk about Hezbollah is in such trouble since the Israeli dismantling of its leadership and its headquarters and its beeper strikes, and it needs money. It needs a place. There's been an influx. Maduro has welcomed Hezbollah fighters with open arms. Come to Venezuela. We'll furnish you with a new passport. What you're going to do here is help with the narcotics trade or launder money for it. That's your new job, and it puts you in proximity to the U.S.
Right. And this is an important point, and it's not just a sort of like right-wing think tank hawkish talking point, which is Politico did a huge expose on this in 2017. So did CNN. Something that people have been talking about for this passport, this thing of importing people from Iran into Venezuela, giving them passports and sending them north to cross the border when the border is open. And this predates Maduro. It goes back to Chavez, Hugo Chavez, the original communist dictator who died in 2013, or I can't quite remember when he died, and Maduro took over from him. But Chavez was the guy who kicked this off, also introducing an element of extreme anti-Semitism into what was a reasonably philo-Semitic country in the north of South America, with weird, weird valences of that sort of left-wing anti-Semitism axis with Russia on the one hand and Iran on the other, even though he was a communist and not a Muslim, but that this was a long-standing plan to help destabilize the United States in some way or other as an ideological matter. He was allied with Cuba. Chavez was a disciple of Castro's, and this has been a 20-year goal or sort of effort on the part of the Venezuelan regime. What remains striking about this is for 60 years or 70 years, the United States has warned and threatened regimes all the time and says, stop doing this and stop doing that. And the implicit threat is always, we can do things to you. We really can. And for a while, that was the threat of assassination. And then we kind of dropped assassinations as a tactic. I don't know when, 50 years ago, we stopped thinking that was really a viable way to try to change policy. So we yelled a lot, we screamed a lot, and then a couple of 3 or 4 times, we actually did go in and decapitate regimes. Right? We did it in Panama, we did it in Grenada, we did it in Iraq in 2003, we did it in Afghanistan in 2001, with mixed results. Trump is saying basically, everything is on the table, and the threats are bad. Like, I'm going to say things like, "Don't do this," and "Don't laugh." But Time to stop laughing.
But this is where I'm going to push back again, because he does say that, and he has said that to Iran, which isn't in our hemisphere, because he cares and is a great ally and supporter of Israel. But he will be out of office in 3 years, and whoever comes next is unlikely to be as much of a supporter of Israel, both if it's Vance on the MAGA coalition or if it's anyone from the Democratic Party. So my concern going forward is that he needs to start sending those messages globally. So if China, which is already making moves to invade Taiwan, invades Taiwan, will he do something similar? Will there be a similar sort of expression of we don't allow this? I don't think so. And we've obviously seen a lot of back and forth with Ukraine. And we know there's been a sort of secondary foreign policy being run out of state by Colby and others who are pro-Vance and not exactly pro-Russia, but really don't mind that Russia's doing what it's doing in the region. And
damn, she's giving the game away. She says she wants an interventionist American foreign policy because it's good for Israel. What does this Trump-Venezuela operation mean for Greenland? Right? Trump is willing to use direct military force to seize control of territories in the Western Hemisphere. It views as strategic assets. He wants to move into much more transactional diplomacy. He's either going to buy Greenland or he's going to seize Greenland. And what do the people who rule Iran think right now? So you'd have to think that the U.S. capture of Maduro has fundamentally altered the risk calculus for the Iranian leadership. Trump has removed a sitting head of state, and he signaled that regime change is not merely rhetorical, it's an operational reality. Iran was allied with Venezuela, and Iran now looks quite vulnerable.
And obviously the total abandonment of Europe. So I'm not saying we have to. I just feel like sometimes Donald Trump sounds like he's running a Cold War playbook. And when he talks about the oil companies and he talks about the regime change, but we are not in a Cold War century anymore. And there are all kinds of different polarities globally that I don't think we can dismiss out of hand, even if he has been, and I think, thank goodness, has been very tough on Iran and a very good ally of Israel.
I totally agree with you. And I think that the inconsistencies in the policy in relation to Ukraine are very problematic because they do muddy the waters and they introduce a note of uncertainty about American resolve. Not even about we should support, it's not even about democracy. Zelensky is democratically elected and Putin's a dictator and all that, which you could go to. He doesn't want to go to that. It is, this country was invaded illegitimately in the center of, not in the center of Europe, but on the European continent, first war on the European continent since World.
So Tim Dillon has stopped showing up in my feed. Is he being punished by the algorithm for his Israel skeptical commentary? So I watched Tim Dillon for the first time in ages. Here he is, back to Iran.
Not quite happy with the peace deal that has been proposed, which would leave the Ukraine intact as a state with a military and defense capabilities and security guarantees from America and other Western countries. Putin, not so much, doesn't love that. So Putin is basically going, hey, we want to kind of dismantle what's left of the Ukraine. There's been hundreds of thousands of casualties on the Russian side, more than Ukraine. It's been a prolonged, bloody war, which up until recently, we have not shown a huge interest in stopping. In the beginning, we were telling Zelensky, don't negotiate, and this thing spiraled out of control into a multi-year bloodbath where now we are now trying to do what we did, knock on wood, maybe in the Middle East, some type of peace deal. Well, I don't know what's going on in Gaza now. Is it good? Is everything good now? It doesn't feel like everything is good. From my, it doesn't feel like everything's good. Get up this smart city that Jared Kushner is going to build over there. He's heavily involved in the smart city. Everybody's like, Jared Kushner did such a great job with the peace deal and Witkoff. He's done such a great job of the peace. That's what his interest is, peace. And what a great job they've done bringing peace to the Middle East. Jared Kushner's out there he wants the best for those people in Gaza. Now, let's bring those renderings up. You know me, I like real estate. I love a rendering. Let's get that rendering up of a modern, smart city, like a futuristic, maybe a blend between Miami, and it has elements of Vegas, a lot of hotels. Let's look at what they're doing over there, what they hope to do. They hope to build this really advanced city and turn that, as Kushner said, incredibly valuable land over there into like a paradise where you can go to a resort, you can go have a meeting with a tech company if you'd like. You can have fun. You can do whatever you want. You can invest. You can go over there and get a condo by the beach. This is what they're trying to do. There it is. Get that up. There it is. So this is the future of Gaza, according to Kushner, Netanyahu, Witkoff. This is the beautiful shining city on a hill that they want to build. Now, so here's my question. Who lives there? Is that being built for the people in Gaza? I think, and again, I don't want to cast aspersions on people's motives or whatnot, but I'm thinking to myself, now I don't know, I have no inside info, but I'm looking at this and I'm thinking to myself, I don't think this is being built for the people in Gaza. I'm just throwing it out there. I know that maybe I'm wrong. I've been wrong before about many things. Dairy is bad for my skin. I've been wrong about a lot. This doesn't seem like this is being designed for the people that currently live in Gaza. It almost feels like you would have to move them out, and in order to build this, I mean, I don't know much about construction. I'm not that guy. I can't tell you how to build a home. I know a little bit. But I think in order to build this, you would have to get the people who live there to leave.
Okay, enough of that. Talk to you later, mate. Bye-bye.